Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was declared a UA traitor part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 from Wattpad. So let's start the video. Izuku Midoriya walked through the crowded hallways of a high school, his mind filled with his plans for the day. He was focused on improving his control over 𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗏, determined to live up to the legacy that All Might had entrusted him with. However, something felt off. He couldn't shake a sense of unease as he approached his classroom. When he opened the door, he was met not by his classmates but by two familiar figures standing in the middle of the empty room, Aizawa and All Might. Both wore serious expressions, their postures tense. "Midoriya, we need to talk," Aizawa said, his voice devoid of its usual gruffness. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, and they seemed to carry a hint of sadness. Midoriya's heart sank as he realized this wasn't a normal conversation. Is something wrong, sensei?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly as he stepped into the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and he felt an invisible weight settle over him. All Might took a step forward, his face solemn. "Young Midoriya, I know how much you've given to carry 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. But after much deliberation, we've made a decision." Midoriya's heart raced, and he could barely find his voice. "A decision about what?" Aizawa's capture weapon flicked out in an instant, wrapping around Midoriya's arms and binding him tightly. Midoriya's eyes widened in shock. "Hey Aizawa-sensei, what are you doing?" Aizawa's gaze remained fixed. "I'm sorry, Midoriya. This is necessary." All Might's face was filled with sorrow as he approached Midoriya, his hand glowing faintly with the power of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. "I trusted you with this power, but we have determined that, for the safety of everyone, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 must be returned." Midoriya's heart shattered as he struggled against Aizawa's hold. "No, All Might, please. I've worked so hard, I've done everything I could." But his pleas were met with silence. All Might placed a hand on Midoriya's shoulder, his expression heavy with regret. "Young Midoriya, you're a true hero in spirit. But sometimes hard choices have to be made." With that, All Might took a hair from Midoriya's hair, transferring 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, drawing the quirk out from Midoriya's body. Midoriya felt a surge of energy leaving him, a deep emptiness settling within him as the power he had worked so hard to amass slipped away. The process was swift, yet it left him feeling hollow and powerless. As All Might stepped back, Midoriya slumped forward, held up only by Aizawa's binding. "Why?" Midoriya whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Why would you? Take it away." All Might's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, young Midoriya. I hope one day you'll understand." Aizawa released him, and Midoriya collapsed to the ground, his body weak and his spirit broken. Aizawa and All Might exchanged a somber glance before they left the room, leaving Midoriya alone with the silence and the weight of their decision. As Midoriya lay on the cold floor of the empty classroom, struggling to process the devastating loss of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up, his vision blurred by tears, only to see 𝗍𝗫 standing at the doorway, flanked by police officers. The small principal's expression was unusually serious, devoid of his typical cheerful demeanor. "Midoriya," 𝗍𝗫 began, his voice calm but firm, "I'm afraid this decision extends beyond just removing 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 from you." Midoriya's eyes widened, dread pooling in his stomach. What do you mean?" 𝗍𝗫 took a step forward, his small figure casting a large shadow in the doorway. "Given recent events and for the safety of the public, we have determined that it is necessary for you to be placed in custody." The police officers behind 𝗍𝗫 stepped forward, and Midoriya could feel their intent, a chill running down his spine. He instinctively tried to back away, even though he felt powerless without 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. "Please, Principal 𝗍𝗫. I don't understand," Midoriya stammered, his voice filled with desperation. "What did I do wrong? Why are you doing this to me?" 𝗍𝗫's face softened, but only for a brief moment. "Midoriya, this is not easy for any of us. However, we believe this is the best course of action to ensure the safety of everyone, including yourself. Tartarus has the resources to monitor and help you. The words hit Midoriya like a punch to the gut. The reality of what was happening sank in as the officers approached him, placing 𝗳𝗍𝗪𝗃𝗃 around his wrists. The cold metal against his skin felt surreal, each click echoing in his mind. "No, no, please," he cried, struggling weakly against their hold. I don't understand. I just wanted to be a hero. I only wanted to help people." The officers ignored his pleas, lifting him to his feet. Izawa and All Might stood in the background, their faces a mix of regret and sorrow, but neither of them spoke. Midoriya's heart broke as he looked at his former mentor, who now wouldn't even meet his gaze. The walk out of the school was quiet and filled with a heavy atmosphere. Midoriya could feel the stares of other students peering from the windows, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The whispers began as they watched their classmate, the once hopeful hero, being skirted by the police. As they reached the school's gates, a prison transport vehicle waited, its dark metal surface cold and unwelcoming. The officers guided Midoriya inside, locking him in the heavily secured cell meant to transport criminals to Tartarus prison. Sitting alone in the back of the vehicle, Midoriya's mind raced with a torrent of emotions: confusion, fear, betrayal, and heartbreak. He had lost everything in the span of a few short moments. One for all, his dreams of being a hero, and the trust of those he had looked up to. As the vehicle began to move, Midoriya could only sit in silence, staring at the metal walls around him. He felt hollow, as though a part of him had been ripped away, leaving nothing but an emptiness that he wasn't sure he could ever fill. The gates of Tartarus loomed ahead, a dark fortress that now stood as his prison. His journey as a hero had come to an end, replaced by a nightmare he could never have imagined. As then after weeks we see Midoriya being taken to court as he was malnourished, as he was barely able to walk. The courtroom was tense, packed with reporters, heroes, and onlookers who had once celebrated Izuku Midoriya as the symbol of the next generation. Now, however, they stared at him in chains, eyes filled with contempt. The boy who once bore the weight of the world's hope now looked broken, a ghost of his former self. His green eyes, once so full of determination, were hollow, and his hands were shackled, ensuring no sudden movements. His mother, 𝗵𝗃𝗄 Midoriya, sat in the front row, clutching a crumpled handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. She looked small, defeated, her entire body trembling as she watched her son, the boy she had raised to be a hero, face the wrath of an unrelenting system. The prosecutor, a stern man with sharp eyes and a cruel twist to his lips, paced in front of the jury. In his hands he held Izuku's journal, waving it in the air as though it were a weapon. "This," he sneered, "is not just a journal. This is a detailed analysis of every hero and quirk at you. Hi, complete with weaknesses, strategies, and detailed combat notes. This is not the work of a hero in training. This is the work of a traitor." A murmur of shock rippled through the room, and Izuku winced, feeling the weight of every accusing gaze. He tried to raise his voice, but it came out as a whisper. I did it to understand. To be prepared." The prosecutor scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Prepared? For what, Midoriya? To betray us? To hand over valuable information to villains?" He shook his head, letting the silence hang heavily. No true hero would need to know how to bring down their friends. Izuku's fists clenched, a surge of anger bubbling beneath his despair. "It was never meant for that. I wanted to protect them." But no one listened. The crowd seemed deaf to his words, and his former classmates watched in cold silence. One by one, they took the stand, each delivering their testimony like a final nail in his coffin. Bakugo, his former friend and rival, shook his head, a rare sadness in his eyes. "Deku, I don't know who you are anymore," he said, his voice rough, but lacking its usual fire. "You had all of us fooled." Todoroki followed, his gaze icy as ever. "We trusted you, Midoriya," he said flatly. "You betrayed that trust. There's nothing else to say." And then Uraraka, tears pooling in her eyes. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the hurt in her voice a sharp contrast to the cold testimonies before. "I thought I knew you, Deku. But when I saw that journal..." She shook her head, swallowing back her emotions. "It was like you were a stranger." Izuku's heart twisted painfully, each friend's words a dagger that cut deeper than any physical wound could. He glanced at his mother, who was barely holding herself together. She looked at him with a pained expression, mouthing, "I believe you," but her support was little comfort against the tidal wave of condemnation. Finally, the judge called for silence as the president of the 𝗳𝗏𝗄 Public Safety Commission took the stage. Her expression was unreadable as she held a document in her hands, the official paperwork that would strip Izuku of his hero status. "Izuku Midoriya," she announced, her voice as cold and unyielding as steel, "in light of the evidence, and under the authority granted to me by the 𝗳𝗏𝗄 Public Safety Commission, I hereby revoke your status as a hero. From this day forward, you are no longer recognized as part of the hero system." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, the finality of her words hanging in the air. Izuku's face was expressionless, yet his mind reeled. Stripped of one for all, abandoned by his friends, and now declared a villain. It was as if every part of him was being erased. The president's gaze hardened as she continued, "Furthermore, you are sentenced to life in Tartarus prison, for the security of our society." At that, Inko stood up, her voice breaking as she cried out, "No. Please. My son isn't a villain. He was only trying to help, to understand." She pushed forward, trying to reach him, but the guards held her back as she fought against them. "Please, you don't understand, he's a hero." But her cries fell on deaf ears. Izuku was already being led away, his head hung low. The courtroom's voices grew distant as his mother's sobs echoed, the final sound of his old life slipping away. As he walked down the hallway, shackled and powerless, a dark realization dawned upon him. They had taken everything from him. His power, his dreams, even his own mother's love was powerless to save him now. He was a shell, a hollowed-out version of the boy who had once believed in justice and heroes. And in that void, a spark of something darker ignited. If they wanted to see him as a villain, if they wanted to cage him as a monster, he would show them just how wrong they were. They would regret the day they cast him aside. Izuku was yanked out of the courtroom in 𝗳𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃s, flanked by officers on either side. His head was lowered, but his eyes burned with anger, seething beneath a surface of quiet resentment. Outside, a sea of reporters awaited, cameras flashing and microphones moved forward, capturing every humiliating moment as he was paraded past them. Behind him, teachers and staff watched with cold, stoic faces, their backs turned on the boy they'd once praised. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions and commentary. One of them sneered, "You students are true heroes for exposing this traitor." Another praised, "Thanks to Bakugo and the others, we can all feel a little safer tonight." Izuku's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. His heart pounded with a furious rhythm, his body trembling with barely contained rage. They were thanking his classmates, praising them for turning on him, for labeling him a villain without ever listening to his side. His mother, Inko, was being held back by security as she tried to reach him, her desperate voice drowned out by the crowd. Some of the reporters turned on her, muttering harsh comments, their words like knives slicing through her. "Guess being a villain runs in the family," one jeered. "What kind of mother raises a traitor? She must be ashamed of him," another added, smirking as Inko's face crumpled with pain. Izuku could feel his blood boiling, his vision narrowing as the anger roared in his ears. Suddenly, in a surge of adrenaline, he twisted against the officers holding him, pulling free. Before anyone could react, he charged toward Bakugo, his former friend and rival, the one who had stood in court and condemned him without hesitation. Izuku's head connected with Bakugo's face in a brutal headbutt, the impact echoing through the chaotic crowd. Bakugo stumbled back, cursing. Just as Izuku's knee came up, his fury channeled into one brutal strike that snapped Bakugo's arm with a sickening crack. "That's for betraying me, you 𝗵𝗃𝗃." Izuku snarled, his voice filled with venom. The officers were on him in seconds, restraining him with more force, pulling him back. But he wasn't finished. His gaze locked onto Uraraka, who had watched it all unfold with wide eyes, her face pale. "You abandoned me for that Pomeranian bee," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness and contempt. "You're nothing but a worthless fraud, a fake hero, no better than the rest of them." Uraraka's face crumpled with shock, hurt flashing in her eyes. But Izuku didn't care anymore. The bitterness and anger had swallowed him whole, turning his once kind heart into a hardened core of resentment. As he was dragged back toward the police van, he could still hear the crowd around him, jeering, condemning, whispering horrible things about him and his mother. The hatred, the betrayal, all of it coiled tighter inside him, feeding the dark flame that had been ignited within him. He glanced back one last time, meeting his mother's tearful gaze, and a bitter resolve settled into his heart. They had destroyed him, everything he'd believed in, everything he'd fought for. And now they would all pay. Inko's heart shattered as she watched her son dragged away, his face still twisted in anger and betrayal. She broke free from the security holding her back and ran after him, her voice trembling as she called out desperately, "Izuku! Izuku, please!" Izuku, handcuffed and held tightly by the officers, turned his head just enough to catch a glimpse of his mother pushing through the crowd. Her face was a mixture of terror, heartbreak, and helplessness, a look he'd never seen before, and one he wished he could erase. He clenched his jaw, a pang of guilt slipping through the cracks in his rage. "Izuku Midoriya, please stay back," one of the officers shouted, trying to stop her, but she refused to listen. She stumbled forward, her breaths ragged, as her trembling hand reached out toward the police van where her son was being shoved inside. "Please, don't take him," she cried, her voice breaking. "Izuku's not a villain. He's my son. My precious boy. Please, just give him a chance to explain." The crowd watched, some with pity, others with judgment in their eyes. Whispers floated through the air, their venomous words piercing her like knives. Poor woman. She raised a monster. She should have known better. He was always too close to those villains, wasn't he? Inko's knees nearly gave way as she heard the hateful comments, but she forced herself to stay upright, her love for her son giving her strength. She reached the police van just as the door was about to close and caught one last glimpse of Izuku's face through the bars. His eyes softened, just for a moment, a flicker of sorrow and regret in his gaze. "Izuku," she called out, her hand pressing against the cold metal of the van's door. "I'll fight for you. I won't let them take you away like this." Izuku's eyes locked onto hers, the anger melting away for a brief second, replaced by something vulnerable, something that reminded her of the little boy who used to cling to her leg, wide-eyed and hopeful. But then, the door slammed shut, cutting off her view, and the van roared to life, pulling away. Inko collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son disappear down the road, taken from her by a world that had turned against him. Her sobs filled the air, raw and heart-wrenching, a mother's love laid bare for everyone to see. "Izuku, I'm so sorry," she whispered, clutching her chest as though she could hold together the pieces of her broken heart. "I won't give up on you. I'll find a way to get you back, no matter what." But as the crowd dispersed, with whispers and harsh glances cast her way, Inko realized that her battle was only beginning. The world had branded her son a villain, and now, it seemed, she would have to stand alone against everyone to prove his innocence, even if no one believed in him but her. Izuku Midoriya's heart throbbed with grief and fury as she marched towards the U. Faculty members gathered outside the courtroom. Her normally gentle face was contorted with rage, her eyes burning with an intensity that caught everyone's attention. Nizu, Aizawa, and All Might stood before her, trying to appear resolute, but they couldn't mask the unease they felt under her seething glare. She stopped in front of All Might first, her hands trembling with emotion. Without warning, her hand shot up, and she slapped him hard across the face, the sound echoing around them. The shock was evident in All Might's eyes, but he didn't retaliate. He stood there, speechless, as Inko's voice rose, full of hurt and anger. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice breaking. "You, the man my son idolized his whole life. The man who promised to protect him. And this is how you repay him. By letting him be taken away like a criminal." All Might's face fell, guilt overtaking him as he tried to form words, but 𝗵𝗃 didn't give him a chance. She turned to Aizawa, her fury unwavering. "And you, 𝗳𝗍𝗧𝗟𝗘. You knew Izuku, you saw him fight for his classmates, for you, for this school. Did none of that mean anything to you?" Her voice dripped with contempt. "You all called him a hero, until it was easier to cast him aside." Aizawa looked down, unable to meet her piercing gaze, shame evident in his silence. Just then, 𝗵𝘃𝗧𝗵𝗃 approached, worry etched on her face. She reached out as if to comfort 𝗵𝗃, but 𝗵𝗃 recoiled, her expression darkening further. "Don't you dare." 𝗵𝗃 spat, her voice laced with venom. "Don't even consider me your friend anymore, 𝗵𝘃𝗧𝗍𝗍. Because of your brat, my son is in jail." Katsuki's recklessness, his hatred, all of it led to this. Her hands clenched, her quirk, which she usually kept under control, began to flicker, a manifestation of her overwhelming emotions. Before anyone could react, she extended her hand toward Katsuki, who was standing nearby, watching the scene with a mix of annoyance and confusion. In a sudden surge of her quirk, she targeted the nerves in Katsuki's arm, tugging sharply. Katsuki gasped, his face contorting in pain as his arm jerked involuntarily. He gritted his teeth, clutching his wrist as his nerves burned under her influence. "𝗵𝗃, stop!" 𝗵𝘃𝗃 cried, horrified as her son stumbled backward, wincing in agony. The police moved quickly, restraining 𝗵𝗃 before her quirk could escalate further, but her fury remained. Despite the officers holding her back, she managed to cast one last, withering glare at 𝗵𝘃𝗃. "This is my return gift, 𝗵𝘃𝗃. The pain my son feels. Consider this just a fraction of what I feel now." 𝗵𝘃𝗃, shaken and heartbroken, pleaded with the police, "Please, drop the charges. She's a mother in pain. I can't blame her for lashing out." The officers exchanged glances, reluctantly easing their grip on 𝗵𝗃 but informing her that she would be put under house arrest due to the incident. 𝗵𝗃 didn't resist. She simply slumped, her rage fading into a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume her. Back at home, 𝗵𝗃 sat alone, confined but lost in her anguish. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she clutched a photograph of her son, the boy who had once been her joy, her pride. She whispered to the empty room, her voice barely a breath. "Izuku, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." The house was silent, save for her quiet sobs, echoing her endless worry and heartbreak for her son, who now faced an uncertain future. After 1 week, 𝗵𝗃 sat alone in her dimly lit living room, a glass of sake trembling in her hand as fresh tears streamed down her face. The grief had settled into a heavy weight in her chest, so unbearable that she could hardly breathe. She picked up her phone with shaky fingers, scrolling through her contacts until she found his name, her husband. The one she had once leaned on for strength, now a distant voice she could only hope would answer her desperate call. The dial tone rang once, twice. But no answer. The line clicked over to the message recorder, and 𝗵𝗃's heart sank, but she refused to let this be the end. She took a shaky breath, her voice breaking as she spoke into the silence. "Hisashi. It's me, 𝗵𝗃." She swallowed, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Please. Please, I need you. Izuku needs you." She paused, fighting through a fresh wave of sobs. "They've taken him, Hisashi. They've taken our son. You live. The court. Everyone. They branded him as a villain, as a traitor. They're locking him away for life, and I can't do this alone. He's just a boy. A boy. They took one for all from him, stripped him of everything." Her voice grew weaker, barely above a whisper. "They've labeled him something he's not. And I wasn't strong enough to stop them. I need you here. I need you to help save him, Hisashi. Please, if you ever loved us, if you still care. Come back. Come back and help our son." Her words trailed off, her voice lost to quiet, choked sobs as she pressed the phone to her forehead, as though hoping that somehow he could feel her pain across the distance. "I don't know what to do without you. Without him," she whispered, clutching the phone to her chest, as if the mere action could bridge the gap between them. The line clicked off, the message sent, and 𝗵𝗃 sat there in the silence, drowning in her sorrow. Her heart felt hollow, an aching void that nothing could fill. Another shaky sip of sake, the bitterness only amplifying the emptiness within her. She stared blankly at the wall, wondering if her plea would reach him, or if she would be left to face this nightmare alone. As we see some pictures kept as she saw herself with her husband in, not wondering if he will answer or not. Inko sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she took another sip from the half-empty bottle in front of her. The bitter taste did little to numb the ache in her heart, a hollow pain that felt like it might tear her apart. She could hardly believe how quickly everything had unraveled, the husband who had once been her steady rock, the boy who had been her world. Both gone, one by one. First, her husband had been called to America for work, and now her precious Izuku, taken from her by people she had once trusted, people she thought were family. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down at the screen, finding yet another notification. Her inbox was flooded with messages, nasty, hateful words hurled at her and Izuku from strangers who knew nothing of the boy he truly was. "Your son's a monster," read one. "You raised a traitor," spat another. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Just another worthless family of villains." The words cut her like a knife, each one tearing open the wound in her chest a little wider. She couldn't bear it anymore, couldn't hold back the tears that spilled down her face as she scrolled through the hate filling her inbox. Trembling, she reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. She needed to hear his voice, needed to believe there was someone else in this world who cared about their son. But the call only rang until a voicemail clicked on. She took a shuddering breath, choking back a sob as she left a message. "Please, come back," she begged into the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our son. They took him and I don't know what to do. He's all alone, and I can't protect him. Please come home. Help me save him. I can't lose him too." She hung up, her heart shattering into pieces. As she gripped the bottle tighter, tears continued to stream down her face, each one a reflection of the bitterness and grief that had taken root in her soul. Izuku stumbled as he was dragged forward, shackled at the wrists and ankles, the weight of his chains heavy against his bruised skin. The guards flanked him on either side, their faces grim and devoid of any compassion. He kept his gaze fixed forward, refusing to meet their eyes as they led him through the imposing gates of Tartarus. The sheer scale of the prison loomed over him, its walls high and unyielding, shrouded in cold, unwelcoming steel. He felt the sting of a needle as a technician took his BLD, his DNA catalogued as they prepared to strip him of any identity beyond his inmate number. The retinal scanner blinked in front of him, the light bright and harsh as he was forced to look into it. The last remnants of his old life were torn from him, his records, his very essence now bound to this place of darkness. The guards wasted no time. Rough hands pushed him forward, and Izuku staggered, barely catching himself before being shoved into his cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him with a deafening finality, the echo reverberating through the cold walls as if the prison itself was swallowing him whole. Izuku looked around the dim, narrow cell, a stark concrete box with barely any light, save for the faint glow filtering through the small, barred window high above. He could hear the faint hum of the facility's machinery, the distant sounds of footsteps and voices, all fading into an oppressive silence that weighed on him like a lead blanket. He clenched his fists, the reality settling in. They had cast him away, discarded him like he was nothing. Anger bubbled beneath his calm exterior as he lowered himself to the cold floor, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, plans forming and unraveling in the back of his mind. They thought they could lock him away, cage him in this pit, and silence him. But he would prove them wrong. This was just the beginning. Izuku glanced around the dim cell, noting the two figures already present, the infamous villains he'd heard whispers of back in society. Both men eyed him with a mixture of contempt and amusement, their twisted grins wide with the satisfaction of seeing a former hero in turn brought low. Well, look at what we have here. Little Deku, the wannabe hero, sneered one of the villains, a towering figure with scars across his arms, evidence of past battles. His companion, a wiry man with a cruel smile, laughed, leaning against the wall as he looked Izuku up and down like prey. "You thought you could save people, didn't you, hero?" He jeered, mocking the very title that once defined Izuku. Now look at you. Just another rat trapped in a cage. Izuku tensed, his fists clenching as the taunts dug into his skin. But before he could react, the larger villain lunged, landing a punch squarely in his stomach. The impact sent him stumbling back, the force nearly knocking the wind out of him. He bit down, refusing to make a sound. Showing pain here, showing weakness, that would only fuel them more. The wiry villain closed in next, grabbing a handful of Izuku's hair and yanking him up to meet his gaze. Look at you, all high and mighty in your hero dreams, he hissed, slamming Izuku's head against the wall, each impact resonating with a painful thud. Where are your classmates now? Your friends? Bet they're all laughing at you for getting yourself thrown in here. Izuku's vision blurred, but he steadied himself, his mind stubbornly pushing back against the pain. Each punch, each kick, felt like a new strike against not just his body but his pride. This was his reality now, a hell where his past identity was used against him, where the villains thrived on his suffering. The assault continued, the two villains taking turns, savoring each blow, each twisted word aimed to break him down. But as he slumped to the floor, bruised and bleeding, Izuku's resolve only grew sharper, like iron forged in fire. Every strike, every mocking word, was fuel to the hatred building inside him. This wasn't just a beating, it was the spark of a new purpose, one that burned deeper and darker than anything he'd known before. The torture, he realized, was just beginning. Next few weeks, day after day, Tartarus became a relentless cycle of torment for Izuku. No corner of the prison offered safety, no break existed from the endless onslaught. In the cafeteria, villains would swipe his food, laughing cruelly as they dumped trays over his head, staining his face with cold, uneaten meals. Hunger gnawed at him, but each attempt to eat led to more ridicule, more pain. The washroom was a new level of humiliation. The moment he entered, waiting predators would corner him, forcing him onto the grimy floor. Go on, Deku, give it a nice clean, they'd sneer, shoving his face towards the toilets, forcing him to scrape his knuckles against the filthy tiles. His pride was trampled, yet he endured, his silent resolve like a quiet, unbreakable wall within. The courtyard offered no reprieve. Here, in broad daylight, where guards turned a blind eye, his tormentors treated him like a human punching bag. Izuku felt the bruises multiply, his muscles aching with every fresh kick, every knuckle that struck bone. Villains would circle him, taking turns, laughing as his knees buckled and he fell to the ground, struggling to stand upright each. He lost count of the bruises, the cuts, the broken skin. After one particularly brutal day, his limp body was dragged to the prison infirmary, barely conscious and covered in fresh injuries. Lying on the cot, every inch of him ached, every breath felt like swallowing glass. But beneath the agony, a seething hatred simmered. His body was battered, but his spirit was far from broken. Each bruise, each broken rib, felt like fuel to a silent, burning vow that echoed in his mind, one word resounding in his thoughts: revenge. In Tartarus, pain became Izuku's constant companion, yet paradoxically, so did survival. Each day, the villains would break his bones, split his skin, cut and batter him until he lay barely conscious. And each night, the prison doctor would arrive with cold precision, mending his shattered form with relentless efficiency. Izuku's body was forced to recover, his bones fusing stronger, his endurance growing beneath layers of bruises and scarring. The guards were no less brutal. They had their own twisted games, denying him rest, startling him awake every time he managed to slip into brief, exhausted sleep. Shackles would dig into his wrists and ankles, ensuring he was never comfortable. Each new healing seal only hardened his muscles, calloused his skin, and strengthened the very bones they sought to break. Over weeks, Izuku's body became a weapon forged in agony. His pain tolerance was pushed far beyond the human threshold, his bones as resilient as iron, and his will sharpened like a blade. Every bruise was a badge, every scar a reminder that he was still standing. The torture was meant to break him, but instead, it was creating something altogether unbreakable. With every passing day, he grew more immune to their cruelty, and an unquenchable rage simmered within him, waiting for the day he'd finally be free to repay every one of them for the hell they had inflicted upon him. Inside 𝗳𝗵𝗃 sat in his dimly lit cell, his usual calm replaced with a simmering fury as he replayed the voice message from his wife. The audio trembled with her desperate pleas, her words raw and broken, filled with a pain he'd never wanted her to know. She had begged him to bring their son back, her voice barely holding together as she poured out her anguish. Every word was like fuel to a smoldering fire within him. He had promised her once, on the day they parted, that he would never bring his darkness into their lives again, that he'd stay in the shadows, for her sake and for the sake of their son. But this was different. The very world she had entrusted with their son's safety had betrayed them, branding Izuku a traitor and throwing him into Tartarus. His own flesh and blood, now buried in the darkest depths of society's prison. His hands clenched as his quirk surged, capturing the waves of information that flowed in and out of Tartarus, a power he had kept secret. Suddenly, he detected a small flurry of signals surrounding a new arrival, a frequency spike signifying heightened activity. A prisoner transport had just arrived. He didn't need further confirmation. He knew. They had taken Izuku there. They had taken his son. In that moment, the weight of his promise began to shift under the tidal wave of his rage. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke, but every word held the weight of his resolve. They've crossed a line. And there will be no going back. 𝗳𝗵𝗃's eyes narrowed as he peered through the grainy camera feeds he had managed to hack into, carefully threading his quirk to navigate the prison's surveillance systems. Every day, he watched his son suffer, tossed around, mocked, tortured by villains and guards alike. Izuku's small moments of defiance were crushed almost instantly by the brutal environment of Tartarus. Food was thrown at him rather than given, his bones were broken and left to heal only to be broken again, and every breath he took was met with some new cruelty. Yet 𝗳𝗵𝗃 felt powerless. The dampening cuffs around his wrists and ankles suppressed his abilities, restraining him like iron chains and keeping him from acting. The injuries he carried also held him back, as his own strength had been weakened by his long confinement. His every attempt to reach out was met with unyielding resistance. The rage, the helplessness, was a bitter pill to swallow for a man who had once controlled empires. Every time he watched his son suffer, it was as if the walls around him closed in further, intensifying his rage. But he forced himself to breathe, to remain still, even as fury churned in his chest, twisting his resolve into something darker. "Izuku," he whispered under his breath, his voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I won't let this stand." 𝗳𝗵𝗃 Midoriya's heart pounded with every step she took toward the brightly lit UA hall. Through tear-blurred eyes, she could see the silhouettes of heroes and faculty, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the weight of her presence. Her fists clenched as she thought about the recent rejection she'd faced when begging the government for a new hearing for Izuku's case. MDM president had dismissed her plea without hesitation, deeming the case closed. Her phone had then buzzed with another cruel irony, news of UA throwing a celebration over their so-called success. They were rejoicing while her son rotted in Tartarus. As 𝗵𝗃 entered the hall, the warmth and cheer seemed to drain as her gaze settled on 𝗳𝗵𝗃. The former symbol of peace was laughing, unaware of her approach. But a chill fell over him as he noticed her presence, his smile fading into a look of dread. The unmistakable form of 𝗳𝗏𝗃's shadow appeared behind 𝗵𝗃, a testament to the silent support she felt from her son's fallen mentor. Consider 𝗵𝗃 angry and 𝗳𝗏 behind as she shows same fury without hesitation. She approached 𝗳𝗵𝗃, her steps steady, her face hardened by grief and anger. And then, in one swift motion, her hand flew, striking him across the face with a force that silenced the entire room. The music stopped. The murmurs ceased. All eyes were on them, shock etched into every face present. "You all have the audacity to throw a party," she spat, her voice trembling, "while my son is suffering, tortured every day in that hellhole of a prison you helped put him in. You who once promised to protect him." 𝗳𝗵𝗃 lowered his gaze, guilt radiating from him as her words hit him like a hammer. 𝗵𝗃's mind drifted to the agonizing memory of her last visit to Tartarus, where she had seen her son's frail, battered form in the sterile, cold cell. He had smiled faintly, trying to hide his pain, and had told her not to cry. He'd asked her to stop visiting, not wanting her to witness his torment, and pleaded with her to leave Japan for her own safety. Even in his agony, he'd been thinking of her, sacrificing his comfort just so she could walk free of judgment. As she relived the memory, her voice softened but carried the same intensity. You all turned your backs on him. My boy. My Izuku. And now you celebrate. Her voice cracked. Is this what heroes have become? Tears fell freely down her cheeks, but she didn't care. She met each hero's gaze, her expression full of heartbreak and rage, before turning away, leaving the silent hall and broken stairs behind her. As after 2 days as Inko sat alone in her dimly lit room, broken and bruised, tears streaming down her face, she gathered a small assortment of items that held memories of her son, Izuku. Her hands trembled as she arranged a pine green sweater that her husband had given her, along with a few of Izuku's childhood toys. Beside her lay an open bottle of wine, untouched but offering a strange comfort in its presence. Taking a deep breath, she held her phone up, her face illuminated by the screen as she pressed record. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, her words tangled in raw emotion. Hello, she began, struggling to find her composure. My name is Izuku Midoriya. Or as some of you know me now, the mother of a traitor. Pausing to wipe a tear from her cheek, she continued, her voice strengthening with each revelation. Today, I'm here to tell my story. Because before I am a mother, before I am anything, I am Izuku 𝗵𝗃𝗃. 𝗵𝗃𝗃. My real name, my BRH name, is Izuku 𝗵𝗃𝗃. I am the daughter of Nana 𝗵𝗃𝗃, the former symbol of peace. I am the sister of Kotaro 𝗵𝗃𝗃. And we were just children when our mother left us to pursue her mission as a hero. Her words spilled out in a torrent, years of buried anger and sorrow erupting to the surface. My mother left us for this so-called society, she said, her tone laced with bitterness. She abandoned us, Kotaro and me, to an orphanage. She left us to fend for ourselves. My brother, he grew to hate her, to hate everything she stood for. And as much as I tried to understand her decision, a part of me resented her, too. How could she leave us, her children, for a society that forgets heroes so quickly? Izuku took a shaky sip from the wine bottle, her eyes glossy and distant as she delved into the memories she had tried so hard to forget. And then, my husband. Her voice softened as she remembered him. I met a man after I studied law. He was kind, intelligent, a little mysterious, but he had a warmth that drew me in. We fell in love, and after 3 years of dating, we got married. This pine sweater was a gift from him. Her fingers traced the fabric, clutching it close to her as she continued, her voice tinged with a painful fondness. When I told him I was 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃 with Izuku, he was ecstatic. He was by my side every step of the way, always caring, always gentle. And when our son was born, I saw a joy in him that I thought would last forever. The next part was harder to say, and Izuku hesitated, a fresh wave of pain contorting her face. But one day he told me the truth. He was not just any man, he was all for one, the most feared villain in Japan. He had hidden it from me for as long as he could, afraid of what it would mean for us, for Izuku. He told me he had to pretend he was in America because All Might had damaged him so badly he could no longer show his face. He even admitted that he blocked Izuku's quirk, knowing that our son wouldn't be able to handle the full power of his lineage until he was ready. Ready for the burden that he would one day inherit. Izuku's voice broke as she spoke the last words, her love for both her son and husband mixed with regret and sorrow. This society tore my family apart. My mother died on the battlefield, my husband was branded a monster, and now my son has been left to suffer, to rot in Tartarus for crimes he didn't commit. She placed the phone down, leaning forward as she broke into quiet sobs, her message echoing in the silent room. Izuku's voice cracked, her sorrow and resentment boiling over as she faced the camera, a bitter fury in her eyes. You heroes. Every single one of you. I hate you all so much. Her fists clenched, white-knuckled with rage. My husband. Hisashi, he tried to protect Izuku from this path. He wanted him to live free from the cage of heroism. But Izuku. He was determined, a true hero at heart. And look where it led him. This rotten society took my family, destroyed everything I loved. A tear slid down her cheek as she trembled, her voice softening, almost whispering. I can't handle it anymore. This pain, this emptiness, is too much. Izuku, I know you would hate me for this, my sweet boy. But I can't bear to see you suffer. You deserve better, and I. She choked, struggling to keep going, but determination burned behind her eyes. Her final words were almost a plea, laced with a dark resolve. Destroy them, Izuku. Destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Tear down this world that judges and destroys without a second thought. Avenge what they've done to us. To our family. With a final breath, she turned off the recording, leaving it to upload automatically. The phone fell from her hand as she took a length of cord in trembling hands, tied it firmly, and with her last ounce of strength, let herself slip away. The video went viral within minutes, spreading like wildfire across the internet. The title blazed across screens nationwide, the last words of 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗃, mother of the traitor. Thousands of people watched, the confession sparking chaos and debates. Shock, confusion, horror, each viewer grappled with the revelation of Izuku's bloodline, of Hisashi's identity, and the raw pain of 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's final plea. Hours later, Mitsuki Bakugo, frantic after seeing the video herself, burst into 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's apartment alongside police. Her voice broke as she called out, 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃, where are you? But the words froze in her throat as she entered the room, only to find her dearest friend's lifeless body, hanging, swaying slightly in the quiet stillness. Tears streamed down Mitsuki's face as she stumbled forward, grasping 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's cold hand, sobbing as she whispered, Wake up! 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃, please wake up. But her pleas fell into the silence, as the woman who had once been her closest friend was gone, leaving only pain and the haunting memory of her last words. Meanwhile in Tartarus, Izuku sat chained to the chair, his head bowed, his body bruised and beaten from the relentless torment he endured daily in Tartarus. His wrists and ankles throbbed where the shackles dug into his skin. He tried to numb himself, to block out the world, to ignore the taunts and sneers of the guards around him, who took sick pleasure in breaking the spirit of the once aspiring hero. One guard sneered as he entered the room, holding up a small screen. Guess what we have here, Midoriya? He taunted. A little farewell message from Mommy dearest. Izuku's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with both fear and confusion. The guard shoved the screen in front of his face, pressing play. The video started, and there was his mother, tired, broken, tears escaping her cheeks as she stared into the camera, her voice filled with grief and anger as she spoke of the betrayal and agony inflicted upon their family. Izuku, my sweet boy. Her words trembled, and Izuku's heart shattered as he watched her pain and sorrow spill out. Each word felt like a knife, slicing through him as she confessed her despair, her hatred for society, and the twisted reality that had brought their family to ruin. He could barely breathe as she continued, her voice tinged with a dark resolve he'd never seen in her before. You deserve better, and I. Her voice broke, her expression filled with a chilling sadness. Destroy them, Izuku. Destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Avenge what they've done to us. No. Don't. Izuku's voice cracked, his eyes filling with tears as he shook his head, desperately wanting to reach through the screen and pull her back from this brink. The guard smirked, his tone mocking. Didn't just record it, kid. It's been broadcasted all over Japan. Looks like your mom really wanted to give the world something to talk about. Izuku was shaking, disbelief mingling with a growing dread. No please, this can't. And then the guard's mocking voice delivered the final blow. Oh, and in case you were wondering, your mother's. Well, she's gone. Midoriya took her own life right after recording this little message. Seems even she couldn't bear to be associated with the traitor she raised. Izuku's world crumbled. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest as his mother's last words, Her final plea for revenge echoed in his mind. His body felt numb, but within him, something was shifting, a darkness taking root where hope once resided. "Your fault, kid," the guard continued, his words dripping with malice. "Everyone's calling her the traitor's mother now. Imagine how ashamed she must have been." Izuku's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white, his nails digging into his palms as the rage within him grew. His sorrow and despair twisted, morphing into a relentless fury. All his dreams, all his ideals, had been shattered, and now he had nothing left to lose. For the first time, he felt the embers of vengeance stir in his heart. Meanwhile, All Might watched the video in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed what he'd just seen and heard. Midoriya's confession and her connection to his former foe was already a devastating revelation, but it was the final words that shook him to his core. "Nana had a daughter," he whispered, disbelief flooding his expression as his mind raced. All this time, he'd thought he'd known his mentor's legacy, believed he'd carried on her will without a trace of family to speak of. And now, he realized there was a whole hidden story, a child his mentor had left behind, a son she'd never even known about. Not only that, but Inko's husband had been all for one. The realization struck him like a hammer, the sheer weight of it almost too much to bear. All for one. And Nana's daughter. He muttered, his thoughts spiraling. The enemy he'd spent years fighting, the embodiment of his greatest battles, had somehow entwined himself with his mentor's family, leaving a child who had once idolized heroes, who had fought to become one himself, now condemned and twisted by the system All Might once believed in. Horror crept over him as he watched Izuku's reaction on screen, the pain, the betrayal, and, finally, the flicker of something dark, something cold taking root in the young boy's eyes. This was no longer the same bright-eyed, hopeful student he'd met at U. This was a boy with nothing left, broken and hollowed by his own world. "What have we done?" All Might's voice trembled, the weight of his own responsibility crashing down on him. He'd believed in Izuku, chosen him as a successor, and now that very trust, his decision to remain silent and distant, felt like a mistake he couldn't undo. He saw the sorrowful, defeated image of the boy he'd once promised to protect, a boy who, against all odds, had always believed in him, only to be discarded. The screen went blank, and the silence that followed felt deafening. All Might's hands shook slightly as he clenched them, filled with an indescribable grief and guilt. He could almost feel Nana's spirit beside him, a questioning, heart-wrenching presence. He'd failed her legacy, and worst of all, failed the boy who'd tried so desperately to follow in his footsteps. "We created this," he murmured, his gaze falling to the floor as he wondered if there was any path left to right these wrongs, if Izuku would even want redemption. Or had the cruelty he'd endured already sealed his heart in darkness? The quiet evening in Tashinori's apartment was disrupted by a sudden knock on the door. He paused, feeling an unexpected pang of unease. Something about the knock carried a strange intensity, almost like a warning. He pushed aside his apprehension and went to open it. Before Tashinori could even process who it was, a blur shot past him, landing a fierce punch across his jaw. Staggering back, he tried to focus, but the strikes kept coming. He caught a glimpse of the assailant and felt a pit of dread form in his stomach, 𝗵𝗃. His former mentor's face was twisted with rage as he continued delivering blows. Flashback: it was a quiet night in 𝗵𝗃's modest, dimly lit home when he first noticed the notification of a viral video. He didn't often check the news, but something in the title caught his eye. A video involving Izuku Midoriya, the mother of Izuku, the boy Tashinori had spoken about with such pride. Out of curiosity and the faint tug of concern, he clicked on it. The video began with the shaky image of Izuku, her eyes red and hollow, her face pale, as if all hope had drained from her. She looked exhausted and broken in a way he had never seen, even though he had once met her as a cheerful young mother. Her voice, however, was what truly shook him. It was raw, vulnerable, and filled with bitterness. "I am Izuku Midoriya," she began, clutching the bottle of wine as if it were her only support. "Some of you may know me as the traitor's mother. But today, I have secrets I can't carry anymore. Secrets I refuse to take silently to my grave. Her hand trembled as she brushed away a stray tear, her breathing uneven. My real name is 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃. Yes, my mother was 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃, the former symbol of peace. I was her daughter, one of her 2 children. The words hit 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 like a freight train. He couldn't move, his mind flashing back to memories of Nana. The proud, resilient, heroic woman he had fought beside. She had a daughter he hadn't known, and that daughter was now revealing a terrible truth. I am also the sister of 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗵𝗃, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 continued, her tone growing more resentful, and I inherited her quirk even if I never wanted to use it. My father was killed in the line of duty, and while my mother fought her war for justice, she abandoned me and my brother in an orphanage. My brother, he hated her. He died hating her. And part of me hates her. The bitterness in 𝗵𝗃𝗃's words echoed through 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's heart. He had known Nana's choices were difficult, but he never knew the impact on her children. As he listened, he felt the weight of Nana's legacy grow heavier. Then, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 took a shaky breath and began speaking about her husband, Hisashi. I loved him so much, she confessed, her voice trembling with the memory. I thought he was just a kind, humble man. But later, after we married, he told me the truth. He was all for one. The same man that All Might, that 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃, despised. And he did it for us, to protect us from a world that would judge and scorn our son if they knew he was the child of both a hero's bloodline and a villain's. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's heart twisted painfully as she poured out her soul. The revelation shook him. This boy he had once met was both All for One's son and Nana's grandson. And now, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 and the hero society had thrown him into prison. 𝗵𝗃𝗃's voice grew weaker, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about her son, about how he had been sentenced for things she didn't believe he'd done. Her body shook as she took another sip from the bottle, barely able to hold back her sobs. To all of you heroes out there, I hate you, she said in a broken voice. You're responsible for all of this. You've taken everything from me. From my family. Because of your judgment, my husband has been taken, my son has been destroyed, and I can't go on any longer. Her final words cut through 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's chest like a dagger. To my son, if you're listening, destroy this rotten society that thinks it can tear our lives apart. Then, with a shuddering breath, she set the camera down, her sobs echoing before the screen faded to black. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 was left in silence, stunned, staring at the screen. The pain in his heart quickly ignited into anger. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃's name appeared among those in interviews, alongside others from you. His fists clenched, the betrayal searing through him. He had trained 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 to uphold justice, to honor Nana's legacy. But 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 had allowed her grandson to be branded a traitor and tortured in a prison cell. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. His face was set in determination, and his mind was clear. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 had betrayed Nana's family, and 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 wasn't going to let him off easy. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 read the final update in utter disbelief, his trembling hands clutching the newspaper as the horrific truth sank in. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃, Nana's only daughter, had taken her own life. And her son, Nana's grandson, Izuku, was languishing in a prison cell, falsely accused and branded as a traitor by the very society his grandmother had once fought so hard to protect. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's eyes burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and he felt an anger he hadn't felt in years. How could 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃, the one he had trained and trusted, allow things to spiral into such tragedy? Without a second thought, 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃 threw on his coat and stormed out of his house, his mind set on one thing: putting some sense, and a dose of reality, into his former student. Within minutes, he arrived at 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃's door and pounded on it, the sheer force rattling the frame. 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 opened it, his usual confident posture fading as he saw the stormy expression on his mentor's face. Before 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 could even speak, 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗃's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar. He pulled 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃 close, his voice a low, seething growl. Do you have any idea what you've done? The path you chose has left a family in ruins, a family that your mentor, Nana, fought her entire life to protect. You've betrayed everything she stood for, 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺 tried to stammer a response, but 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺 cut him off with a bitter scoff. You threw Nana's grandson into prison, believing the lies instead of searching for the truth. You let an innocent boy be condemned without a second thought, and for what? To uphold this corrupted society. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺's fist clenched, and he couldn't restrain himself any longer. His fist connected with 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺's jaw, sending him stumbling back in shock. You let this society turn Nana's family into scapegoats. You betrayed her memory, her bloodline, and now her daughter is dead, 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺. Inko is gone, because of your so-called justice. The words hit 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺 harder than the punch. His face twisted with guilt and realization, as if the truth had finally struck him. His voice was weak as he whispered, "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺 stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. The right thing? You let an innocent boy rot in prison, allowed his mother to be humiliated and broken by a world that cared more about appearances than truth. You've created a monster out of Izuku, a monster that could have been avoided if you had simply looked beyond the surface. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺 lowered his head, his hands trembling as 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺's words sank deep. He could feel the crushing weight of his mentor's disappointment, the sheer betrayal of Nana's memory bearing down on him. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺 took a step back, his voice filled with disgust. "Fix this, 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺. Before it's too late." The only thing holding that boy back was his mother's kindness. With her gone, he has nothing left to stop him from becoming the very thing you fear. Remember this, you planted the seeds of vengeance in Nana's grandson, and if he rises against you, that BLD will be on your hands. Turning his back, 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝐺 left 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝐺 standing there in silence, the crushing reality of his actions finally settling in. Izuku sat chained to the chair, his head bowed, his body bruised and beaten from the relentless torment he endured daily in Tartarus. His wrists and ankles throbbed where the shackles dug into his skin. He tried to numb himself, to block out the world, to ignore the taunts and sneers of the guards around him, who took sick pleasure in breaking the spirit of the once aspiring hero. One guard sneered as he entered the room, holding up a small screen. "Guess what we have here, Midoriya?" he taunted. "A little farewell message from mommy dearest." Izuku's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with both fear and confusion. The guard shoved the screen in front of his face, pressing play. The video started, and there was his mother, tired, broken, tears escaping her cheeks as she stared into the camera, her voice filled with grief and anger as she spoke of the betrayal and agony inflicted upon their family. "Izuku, my sweet boy." Her words trembled, and Izuku's heart shattered as he watched her pain and sorrow spill out. Each word felt like a knife, slicing through him as she confessed her despair, her hatred for society, and the twisted reality that had brought their family to ruin. He could barely breathe as she continued, her voice tinged with a dark resolve he'd never seen in her before. "You deserve better, and I." Her voice broke, her expression filled with a chilling sadness. "Destroy them, Izuku. Destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful. Avenge what they've done to us." "No. Don't." Izuku's voice cracked, his eyes filling with tears as he shook his head, desperately wanting to reach through the screen and pull her back from this brink. The guard smirked, his tone mocking. "She didn't just record it, kid. It's been broadcasted all over Japan. Looks like your mom really wanted to give the world something to talk about." Izuku was shaking, disbelief mingling with a growing dread. "No, please, this can't." And then the guard's mocking voice delivered the final blow. "Oh, and in case you were wondering, your mother's. Well, she's gone, Midoriya. Took her own life right after recording this little message. Seems even she couldn't bear to be associated with the traitor she raised." Izuku's world crumbled. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest as his mother's last words, her final plea for revenge, echoed in his mind. His body felt numb, but within him, something was shifting, a darkness taking root where hope once resided. "Your fault, kid," the guard continued, his words dripping with malice. Everyone's calling her the traitor's mother now. Imagine how ashamed she must have been. Izuku's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white, his nails digging into his palms as the rage within him grew. His sorrow and despair twisted, morphing into a relentless fury. All his dreams, all his ideals, had been shattered, and now he had nothing left to lose. For the first time, he felt the embers of vengeance stir in his heart. Meanwhile, 𝗂𝗍𝗵𝗃 watched the video in stunned silence, his face pale as he processed what he'd just seen and heard. Izuku Midoriya's confession and her connection to his former foe was already a devastating revelation, but it was the final words that shook him to his core. Nana had a daughter, he whispered, disbelief flooding his expression as his mind raced. All this time, he'd thought he'd known his mentor's legacy, believed he'd carried on her will without a trace of family to speak of. And now, he realized there was a whole hidden story, a child his mentor had left behind, a son she'd never even known about. Not only that, but Izuku's husband had been all for one. The realization struck him like a hammer, the sheer weight of it almost too much to bear. All for one. And Nana's daughter. He muttered, his thoughts spiraling. The enemy he'd spent years fighting, the embodiment of his greatest battles, had somehow entwined himself with his mentor's family, leaving a child who had once idolized heroes, who had fought to become one himself, now condemned and twisted by the system All Might once believed in. Horror crept over him as he watched Izuku's reaction on screen, the pain, the betrayal, and, finally, the flicker of something dark, something cold taking root in the young boy's eyes. This was no longer the same bright-eyed, hopeful student he'd met at U. This was a boy with nothing left, broken and hollowed by his own world. What have we done? All Might's voice trembled, the weight of his own responsibility crashing down on him. He'd believed in Izuku, chosen him as a successor, and now that very trust, his decision to remain silent and distant, felt like a mistake he couldn't undo. He saw the sorrowful, defeated image of the boy he'd once promised to protect, a boy who, against all odds, had always believed in him, only to be discarded. The screen went blank, and the silence that followed felt deafening. All Might's hands shook slightly as he clenched them, filled with an indescribable grief and guilt. He could almost feel Nana's spirit beside him, a questioning, heart-wrenching presence. He'd failed her legacy, and worst of all, failed the boy who'd tried so desperately to follow in his footsteps. "We created this," he murmured, his gaze falling to the floor as he wondered if there was any path left to right these wrongs, if Izuku would even want redemption. Or had the cruelty he'd endured already sealed his heart in darkness? In Tartarus, in the depths of Tartarus, All for One sat in his cell, an aura of power muted by the quirk-suppressing restraints that held him. He was accustomed to silence, accustomed to waiting, but the voice that had filled his cell just moments before was one he could never have prepared for. The video of Izuku's confession played in his mind over and over, each word a knife twisting in his heart. He could see her as she was then, his beloved wife, her tears staining her cheeks as she recounted the life they'd shared and the fate that had been dealt to their son. Her anguish, her hatred for the heroes and the society that had shattered their family, and her final plea, a desperate call to end it all, left him numb, and yet, beneath that numbness, a storm of rage began to rise. His fingers clenched into fists as he replayed her words, her broken voice as she confessed their secrets to the world. He'd always known her strength, her loyalty, and her fierce love for Izuku. Yet to see her pushed so far, forced to carry the burden of shame and heartbreak alone, it was too much. His restraint wavered as fury simmered, the containment cuffs crackling with the effort to keep his power in check. "Izuku! Izuku," he whispered hoarsely, his voice laced with grief that he had long thought himself beyond. For all his ambitions, all the power he wielded, he'd failed to protect them, the two people who mattered most in his life. His enemies, the so-called heroes, had ripped his family apart, had branded his son a traitor, and had driven his wife to despair and death. And he could do nothing. Here, in this cold, silent cell, he was powerless, forced to watch from afar as the world took everything from him. Anger boiled within him, a dark, seething rage that threatened to burst through every barrier around him. The heroes had dared to condemn his son, to torture him in Tartarus, to turn his gentle-hearted, bright-eyed boy into a vessel of hate and vengeance. They would pay for it. Every one of them, from the leaders who wielded their power carelessly to the students who turned against Izuku. "You'll regret this, all of you," he muttered, his voice low and filled with a promise of retribution. The guards outside his cell cast wary glances at one another, sensing a shift in the air. The faint hum of his containment devices flickered. All for one's hands flexed, his mind already calculating, his years of planning and patience fusing with an entirely new motivation. He would escape one way or another. And when he did, he would not rest until justice, his justice, had been served. The memory of Inko's last words lingered, her final request echoing in his mind, "Destroy everything for me. Destroy this society." He would honor her plea, tear down the society that had broken her spirit and taken their son. The heroes, and everything they held dear would crumble beneath him. For his wife, for his son, he would make them pay. That night in the dimly lit cell, Izuku sat motionless, his bruised and battered form a testament to the relentless torment he had endured. But tonight, something in him had finally snapped. The rage and despair within him had simmered and boiled until they transformed into a cold, focused resolve. Every injury, every scar, every fractured bone had been forged into strength, hardening him physically and mentally. Slowly, he rose to his feet, shackles straining against his renewed force. With a single, powerful flex, the chains shattered, metal fragments clinking to the floor. His once kind, determined eyes were now vacant and hollow, devoid of hope or compassion. He looked around at his cellmates, who'd taken sadistic pleasure in his suffering, and they saw something in him that froze them in place, an unyielding fury that chilled to the bone. Without hesitation, Izuku moved through them like a storm, every punch, every strike landing with unrestrained power. They screamed as he broke their bones, delivering injuries they'd never forget, tearing through them with ruthless precision. He held nothing back, his movements relentless and efficient. As he stood amidst the broken bodies, his expression remained disturbingly blank, his gaze fixed on some distant point. His mind held only one thought, a vow of vengeance. The boy who had once dreamt of saving others was gone. Now, only a hollow shell remained, a being forged from hatred and betrayal, seeking to unleash a reckoning on those who had stripped him of everything. Izuku lay down on the cold, hard floor of his cell, trying to find a semblance of peace amidst the rage that still simmered within him. But his attempt to rest was cut short when a group of guards stormed into his cell, sneering and taunting him. This time, however, they found no fear in his eyes, only an unyielding, empty darkness. Without warning, Izuku sprang to his feet, his movements swift and lethal. The guard's smirks faded, replaced with panic as he grabbed one by the arm, twisting until a sickening snap echoed through the cell. One by one, they tried to subdue him, but he met each attempt with terrifying ferocity. Limbs were wrenched and torn, bones shattered beneath his hands as he moved like a vengeful spirit, his expression cold and merciless. Shouts and screams filled the corridor as the guards outside saw the brutal scene. Unfolding, only to be drawn in themselves. They rushed to restrain him, but Izuku was unstoppable. He fought with the strength and fury of an Oni, each blow leaving lasting, unforgiving damage. The once quiet prison hallways now echoed with chaos, the guards lying broken and defeated in his wake. As the dust settled, Izuku stood alone, his cell littered with the shattered remains of those who had dared to break him. His breathing slowed and he returned to the cold floor, his hollow gaze drifting upwards. They had tried to reduce him to nothing, but he would be the one to destroy everything they held dear. Next morning the atmosphere in Tartarus grew colder as All Might entered the cell block where 𝗓𝗋 was contained. The two men locked eyes, and despite his restraints, 𝗓𝗋's presence was chilling, an aura of pure malice contained only by the quirk-suppressing cuffs that bound him. For the first time in his life, All Might felt something akin to hesitation as he looked into the face of his old enemy. a man stripped of his power but consumed with rage. As All Might approached, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗀𝗃 gaze narrowed, his voice dripping with venom as he spoke. If it weren't for these 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗧𝗑𝗏, you and every so-called hero out there would be dead by now. His words were low, a quiet promise laced with a hatred that made the air seem heavier. How dare you all? Do you realize what you've done? Because of your selfish actions, your blindness. My wife is dead. Do you even understand the consequences of what you've taken from me? His tone rose, every word a razor aimed at All Might's conscience. All Might stood his ground but struggled to maintain his composure. I didn't know, he began, but 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 cut him off with a bitter, humorless laugh. Didn't know? 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺's eyes were cold, yet they burned with fury. You heroes, you think you're noble, you think you're righteous, but in your arrogance, you've destroyed the lives of the very people you claim to protect. You paraded my son as a traitor and drove my wife to despair. His voice shook, echoing off the walls, filled with raw, unfiltered grief and anger. What happened to her, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗔𝗍? Tell me everything. I want to know what led to her final moments. All Might's own emotions warred within him, guilt mixing with anger as he struggled to find the words. 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗧𝗏, he stammered, feeling the weight of his own role in the events that had unfolded. She revealed everything, your relationship, her past. And in her pain He trailed off, not wanting to say it outright, but knowing there was no avoiding it. She suffered until there was nothing left, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 said, his voice bitter, realizing the truth as it settled heavily upon him. And you all celebrated. His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. You heroes had a party, didn't you? While my son suffered, while my wife was left to rot in despair, you were celebrating. All Might's jaw clenched, feeling the weight of 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺's words. It wasn't, save your excuses, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 spat, eyes blazing with hatred. If my son becomes the monster you all feared, know that it's on you. Every single one of you. This society you uphold, this false peace. It's built on the broken lives of people you don't care about. He leaned forward, his restrained hands trembling with barely contained rage. When I break out of here, All Might, I will not rest until I've destroyed every piece of it, in her name. All Might felt a shiver run down his spine, knowing that, despite his defeated state, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺's resolve had only grown more dangerous. 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺's eyes glinted with a cold, calculating fury as he leaned closer, his restrained hands trembling with barely concealed rage. You planted the seed of vengeance in my son, All Might. You and your precious heroes. Izuku might have had a chance, but now you've pushed him too far. What was holding him back was his mother's kindness, her gentle heart, but after seeing what's been done to her, he won't stay silent anymore. All Might could only listen, feeling the weight of those words pressed down on him like stones. He struggled to find a response, but before he could, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 continued, his voice filled with a dark certainty. You and your 𝗵𝗃𝗃 society have driven him over the edge, he hissed. Remember this, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, he is my son. The blood of destruction flows through him. He could become everything you feared I would be, a symbol of pure evil and devastation, a force that will tear down every one of your so-called pillars of peace. He will take my place. And do you know his quirk, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏? All Might was silent, his face grim. He is an elementalist, able to command every element to his will. I blocked it when he was young, weakened it to keep him safe because his body couldn't handle its power. But tomorrow. 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺's gaze grew more intense. Tomorrow is his birthday, the day he reaches the age where his full potential will awaken. And when he does, I'll be waiting, ready to pass on my power to him. All Might's fists clenched, the reality of what 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 was saying settling heavily in his mind. Tell your 𝗵𝗃𝗃 All Might, 𝗲𝗏𝗺𝗺 sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Tell her she has failed yet another grandchild. First Tenko, now Izuku. Her daughter, her son, and now her grandson, all turned away from her so-called heroism, lost to her noble ideals. They both despised her, Inko and Izuku alike. They hated what she stood for, the way she abandoned family for society's expectations. They are lost because of her, and you. He paused, the hatred in his eyes simmering. Izuku will destroy you, and he will shatter everything you hold dear. This is a promise, All Might. A promise from a father and a husband who will see vengeance delivered, no matter the cost. All Might felt a coldness settle within him, realizing that the man before him wasn't just a villain. He was a father, vowing to leave behind a legacy of hatred that would consume the very heart of the hero world. Inside One for All, inside the realm of One for All, the vestiges of the past wielders stood in stunned silence, watching the chilling scene before them. They could hardly believe what they were seeing, the heartbreaking video of 𝗵𝗃𝗃, a woman they had known only in fragments, now pouring her heart out in raw agony. The air was heavy as her voice filled the space, her words striking each of them with a relentless force. 𝗃𝗃 watched in horror as her daughter's image played on the screen, her once vibrant and hopeful child now a shadow, a woman broken by years of loneliness, betrayal, and grief. Nana's hands trembled as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 recounted her abandonment, the scars left by her mother's choice to leave her and Kotaro behind. Each word was a knife, a painful reminder of the sacrifices Nana had made, choices she had believed were right for the greater good, but now realized had left a deep, irrevocable wound. As 𝗵𝗃𝗃 revealed the truth about Hisashi, Nana's heart sank further. She had never known that her own grandson, Izuku, bore the legacy of All for One. The weight of her decisions, the generations of suffering they had caused, crashed down on her with unbearable clarity. All Might, too, watched in silent devastation. He had always carried the weight of his mentor's legacy with pride, but now he felt only guilt, seeing the consequences that had rippled through Nana's family. As 𝗵𝗃𝗃's final words echoed, "Destroy them, Izuku. Destroy this society that thinks it can toy with lives and discard people when they're no longer useful." The spirits of One for All were left reeling. This was a woman who had lost everything to a world that glorified heroes, only to abandon those it had deemed unworthy of salvation. 𝗵𝗃𝗃's plea hung heavy in the air, a haunting curse that resonated deep within each of them. Nana collapsed to her knees, her face buried in her hands as she wept, the full weight of her actions finally breaking her. She whispered, "𝗵𝗃𝗃, my dear, sweet 𝗵𝗃𝗃. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this." Her regret echoed, reaching the ears of each One for All user, a reminder that heroism often came at a price, one they had always thought worth paying until now. Yagi, his face filled with grief, rested a hand on Nana's shoulder. "I never knew. I never imagined this would be the cost of our mission," he murmured, his voice choked with sorrow. The others were silent, each lost in thought, burdened by the realization of what their legacy had done to the family they had sworn to protect. 𝗵𝗃𝗃's final image faded, her message lingering in their minds, a testament to the brokenness that lay beneath society's expectations, a challenge to the ideals they had fought so long to uphold. They could no longer ignore the pain their choices had caused, nor the cost that had been paid by those left behind. The spirit of One for All was left with a scar, a reminder that heroism, for all its glory, had a darker side, one that could destroy lives just as easily as it saved them. Nana's spirit shattered further upon hearing 𝗵𝗃𝗃's last, tragic decision. The weight of her daughter's final act hit her like a tidal wave, sinking her into a pit of grief and despair. Her body shook, her cries echoing through the empty, timeless space of One for All, and every past user watched, unable to offer solace for the pain she bore. Each revelation had already torn through Nana. The abandonment of her children, the path Kotaro had taken, the suffering her grandson had endured. But 𝗵𝗃𝗃's final act of desperation was a pain beyond anything she could bear. Her mind replayed the image of her daughter in that dark, lonely room, the hopelessness in her eyes as she recorded her last words. It was a heartbreak she would never recover from, a wound carved so deep that it reverberated through the very core of One for All. But why did it have to be like this? Nana choked out, voice quivering, her hands gripping her chest as if trying to stop her heart from breaking completely. All Might placed a hand on her shoulder, but no words could comfort her. No heroism could erase the reality that her choices had left a legacy of pain, grief, and brokenness for her family. As Nana sat in her despair, the other users shared her guilt, feeling the weight of the tragic history they had all contributed to. In the silent space of One for All, they stood together, mourning not just 𝗵𝗃𝗀, but all the lives and dreams lost to the ideals they had fought so tirelessly to uphold. As 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 out of his 𝗵𝘃𝗲 he left as he didn't say anything as all for one last warning come from behind, and it was a warning for him. My son will take his revenge, all might remember words, he will destroy the society and all the heroes till he doesn't fulfill 𝗵𝗃𝗀 last wish, remember it, all might he will come for you all for one said laughing maniacally. As All Might has one thing, did they really do the right thing, or that they really created a monster that will destroy the society till he doesn't feel satisfied with his work? Meanwhile in cafeteria, the next day in the cafeteria, an unsettling silence blanketed the air as Izuku entered. His figure cast an imposing shadow, his expression hardened, and his eyes void of any remaining trace of innocence or fear. The other inmates, sensing something different, whispered amongst themselves, but a few dared to taunt him, sneering as they tried to provoke him once more. Izuku didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes darkening as he focused on those who approached him with hostility. In a heartbeat, he struck, his movements precise and devastating. Every punch and kick landed with bone-crushing force, and soon, the cafeteria descended into chaos as inmates scrambled to defend themselves or retreat. Behind him, as if conjured by his fury, a haunting silhouette of a monstrous Oni seemed to loom, its sharp fangs and wild, demonic eyes amplifying the menace Izuku radiated. The sight chilled everyone to the core, and the bravest inmates who had once taken pride in tormenting him now trembled. One by one, Izuku tore through them, his expression never changing. The force of his strikes left them writhing on the floor, bones broken, their screams echoing throughout the prison walls. Some tried to crawl away, but Izuku showed no mercy, ensuring each one felt the weight of every blow he'd endured at their hands. The guards watched, paralyzed, as Izuku single-handedly dismantled the cafeteria. To them, he looked like a true Oni, his rage manifesting into something unstoppable and terrifying. This was no longer the boy they had ridiculed and beaten down. He was now a relentless force, hardened and shaped by the unforgiving treatment he'd suffered. And as the last of his aggressors lay broken before him, Izuku straightened, an emotionless, hollow gaze sweeping over the silent, fearful room. His mind was clear, and one thought remained: vengeance. Izuku strode to the counter, his presence alone making the cafeteria worker hesitate. The server, who had once delighted in withholding food or throwing scraps to mock him, now stared back, hands trembling. "Give me food," Izuku demanded, his voice low and cold. "Better than the scraps you hand out to these BSs." The server swallowed, glancing nervously at the guards who now averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene after witnessing the carnage Izuku had unleashed. With a shaky nod, the server quickly scooped a proper portion onto Izuku's tray, giving him the best he could offer without a second thought. Izuku didn't thank him. Without sparing another glance, he took his tray and found an empty table, the inmates around him silent, casting wary glances as he sat. No one dared approach or even whisper, the terror in the air palpable. For the first time, they realized that the boy they had mocked, the one they had tried to break, was now someone far beyond their reach, someone even they feared. Izuku finished his meal, then stood, letting his gaze sweep over the silent cafeteria. His voice cut through the tense air, calm but laced with a promise of violence. "I want a better bed. And better conditions in my cell," he said slowly, making sure every guard, inmate, and staff member heard. "If I don't get it, there will be consequences." As he made his way toward the gym, those nearby instinctively parted to let him pass. When he reached the training area, he turned back to the guards lingering by the door. "I'm here to train. Any of you idiots dare to interrupt me, you'll face the Oni you're all so afraid of." The guards shifted uncomfortably, sharing uneasy glances but staying rooted where they were, uncertain and wary. Izuku's reputation was spreading quickly, his presence now a shadow hanging over the prison, a vengeful force none dared to challenge. Izuku lifted the barbell, its weight effortless in his grip. He sensed the few prisoners creeping up behind him, whispering and snickering, clearly underestimating his resolve. In one swift motion, he swung the barbell backward, feeling it connect with it. Satisfying thud as the first inmate stumbled back, clutching his face in shock. The others quickly tried to back away, but Izuku's eyes narrowed, and he lunged forward, the barbell moving like an extension of his fury. One by one, each prisoner fell under his relentless strikes. BLD splattered as he landed blow after blow, his face emotionless and unyielding. Groans of pain filled the gym, and yet he continued, leaving no one standing. By the time he stopped, the once pristine barbell was dripping with BLD, his hands gripping it tightly as he stood over the broken bodies around him. The others in the gym could only watch, frozen, as Izuku let the barbell drop with a chilling clang. Without a word, he turned his back on the carnage and walked away, leaving behind the bruised and bleeding prisoners. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a dark, unspoken promise for anyone else foolish enough to test him. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵𝗃. It was a quiet night in 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵's modest, dimly lit home when he first noticed the notification of a viral video. He didn't often check the news, but something in the title caught his eye. A video involving Izuku Midoriya, the mother of Izuku, the boy 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵 had spoken about with such pride. Out of curiosity and the faint tug of concern, he clicked on it. The video began with the shaky image of Izuku, her eyes red and hollow, her face pale, as if all hope had drained from her. She looked exhausted and broken in a way he had never seen, even though he had once met her as a cheerful young mother. Her voice, however, was what truly shook him. It was raw, vulnerable, and filled with bitterness. "I am Izuku Midoriya," she began, clutching the bottle of wine as if it were her only support. "Some of you may know me as the traitor's mother. But today, I have secrets I can't carry anymore. Secrets I refuse to take silently to my grave." Her hand trembled as she brushed away a stray tear, her breathing uneven. "My real name is Izuku 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵. Yes, my mother was 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵𝗃, the former symbol of peace. I was her daughter, one of her 2 children." The words hit 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵 like a freight train. He couldn't move, his mind flashing back to memories of Nana. The proud, resilient, heroic woman he had fought beside. She had a daughter he hadn't known, and that daughter was now revealing a terrible truth. "I am also the sister of Kotaro 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵," Izuku continued, her tone growing more resentful, "and I inherited her quirk even if I never wanted to use it. My father was killed in the line of duty, and while my mother fought her war for justice, she abandoned me and my brother in an orphanage. My brother, he hated her. He died hating her. And part of me hates her." The bitterness in Izuku's words echoed through 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵's heart. He had known Nana's choices were difficult, but he never knew the impact on her children. As he listened, he felt the weight of Nana's legacy grow heavier. Then, Izuku took a shaky breath and began speaking about her husband, Hisashi. "I loved him so much," she confessed, her voice trembling with the memory. "I thought he was just a kind, humble man. But later, after we married, he told me the truth. He was all for one. The same man that all might, that 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵, despised. And he did it for us, to protect us from a world that would judge and scorn our son if they knew he was the child of both a hero's bloodline and a villain's." 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵's heart twisted painfully as she poured out her soul. The revelation shook him. This boy he had once met was both all for one's son and Nana's grandson. And now, 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵 and the hero society had thrown him into prison. Izuku's voice grew weaker, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about her son, about how he had been sentenced for things she didn't believe he'd done. Her body shook as she took another sip from the bottle, barely able to hold back her sobs. "To all of you heroes out there, I hate you," she said in a broken voice. "You're responsible for all of this. You've taken everything from me. From my family. Because of your judgment, my husband has been taken, my son has been destroyed, and I can't go on any longer." Her final words cut through 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵's chest like a dagger. "To my son, if you're listening, destroy this rotten society that thinks it can tear our lives apart." Then, with a shuddering breath, she set the camera down, her sobs echoing before the screen faded to black. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗵 was left in silence, stunned, staring at the screen. The pain in his heart quickly ignited into anger. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's name appeared among those in interviews, alongside others from 𝗬𝗧𝗏. His fists clenched, the betrayal searing through him. He had trained 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to uphold justice, to honor Nana's legacy. But 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had allowed her grandson to be branded a traitor and tortured in a prison cell. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat. His face was set in determination, and his mind was clear. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had betrayed Nana's family, and 𝗵𝗃𝗄 wasn't going to let him off easy. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 read the final update in utter disbelief, his trembling hands clutching the newspaper as the horrific truth sank in. 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗫, Nana's only daughter, had taken her own life. And her son, Nana's grandson, Izuku, was languishing in a prison cell, falsely accused and branded as a traitor by the very society his grandmother had once fought so hard to protect. 𝗵𝗃𝗄's eyes burned with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. The betrayal weighed heavily on his heart, and he felt an anger he hadn't felt in years. How could 𝗧𝗵𝗲, the one he had trained and trusted, allow things to spiral into such tragedy? Without a second thought, 𝗵𝗃𝗄 threw on his coat and stormed out of his house, his mind set on one thing: putting some sense, and a dose of reality, into his former student. Within minutes, he arrived at 𝗧𝗵𝗲's door and pounded on it, the sheer force rattling the frame. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 opened it, his usual confident posture fading as he saw the stormy expression on his mentor's face. Before 𝗧𝗵𝗲 could even speak, 𝗵𝗃𝗄's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar. He pulled 𝗧𝗵𝗲 close, his voice a low, seething growl. "Fool, do you have any idea what you've done? The path you chose has left a family in ruins, a family that your mentor, Nana, fought her entire life to protect. You've betrayed everything she stood for, 𝗧𝗵𝗲." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 tried to stammer a response, but 𝗵𝗃𝗄 cut him off with a bitter scoff. "You threw Nana's grandson into prison, believing the lies instead of searching for the truth. You let an innocent boy be condemned without a second thought, and for what? To uphold this corrupted society." 𝗵𝗃𝗄's fist clenched, and he couldn't restrain himself any longer. His fist connected with 𝗧𝗵𝗲's jaw, sending him stumbling back in shock. "You let this society turn Nana's family into scapegoats. You betrayed her memory, her bloodline, and now her daughter is dead, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Inko is gone because of your so-called justice." The words hit 𝗧𝗵𝗲 harder than the punch. His face twisted with guilt and realization, as if the truth had finally struck him. His voice was weak as he whispered, "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." 𝗵𝗃𝗄 stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "The right thing? You let an innocent boy rot in prison, allowed his mother to be humiliated and broken by a world that cared more about appearances than truth. You've created a monster out of Izuku, a monster that could have been avoided if you had simply looked beyond the surface." 𝗧𝗵𝗲 lowered his head, his hands trembling as 𝗵𝗃𝗄's words sank deep. He could feel the crushing weight of his mentor's disappointment, the sheer betrayal of Nana's memory bearing down on him. 𝗵𝗃𝗄 took a step back, his voice filled with disgust. "Fix this, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, before it's too late. The only thing holding that boy back was his mother's kindness. With her gone, he has nothing left to stop him from becoming the very thing you fear. Remember this, you planted the seeds of vengeance in Nana's grandson, and if he rises against you, that BLD will be on your hands." Turning his back, 𝗵𝗃𝗄 left 𝗧𝗵𝗲 standing there in silence, the crushing reality of his actions finally settling in. Inside the dark, cold confines of the prison, Midoriya sat atop a heap of battered inmates, a mountain of bruised bodies that lay as a testament to his newfound power and ruthless resolve. His expression was eerily calm, devoid of empathy, as he surveyed the broken bodies beneath him. His eyes had shifted to a haunting form, black sclera surrounding stark white pupils, an unsettling gaze that pierced through the dim light, filling the room with a chilling aura. The prison warden stood paralyzed at the entrance, his heart pounding as he took in the scene. His mind raced back to the stories he'd heard of Tora Oni, the infamous former leader of the Yamazaki clan, a figure so feared that his very name sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened criminals. Midoriya's presence now radiated that same bone-chilling aura, the same relentless, overwhelming strength that Tora Oni was known for. Midoriya's cold gaze shifted to the warden, who involuntarily took a step back, feeling his breath hitch as the young man's eyes locked onto him. It was as if he were staring into the eyes of a demon, a wrathful Oni reborn. Midoriya tilted his head slightly, a faint, twisted smile appearing on his face as he held the warden's gaze. He said nothing, yet the silence spoke louder than any words could, a silent promise of vengeance, a warning that he was beyond the control of anyone or anything. "Bring me what I need," he said in a low, almost guttural voice, every word laced with a threat. "Else, there will be hell to pay." The warden swallowed hard, his mind spinning as he remembered the tales of Tora Oni's unyielding rage and merciless nature. Now, standing before Midoriya, he felt the same aura, the same suffocating dread, a manifestation of pure wrath, ready to tear down everything in its path. Midoriya's voice cut through the silence, sharp and dripping with venom. He fixed the warden with a glare so intense it seemed to freeze the very air around him. "What are you, deaf or just plain stupid he spat, his tone leaving no room for defiance. "Do you want me to tear off one of your limbs so you can finally understand?" The warden felt a chill shoot down his spine as Midoriya's eyes glinted with a dark promise. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming, and in that moment, the warden knew he was dealing with someone far beyond the broken young man they had sentenced to this hell. This was someone transformed, hardened, ruthless, and utterly unafraid. In a desperate attempt to keep his composure, the warden took a shaky breath, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Midoriya's patience had worn thin, and as he took a menacing step forward, the warden stumbled back, the realization dawning on him. This young man wasn't simply another prisoner to be subdued. He was a force of vengeance, ready to rip through anyone in his path. "Now," Midoriya continued, voice steady but laced with deadly intent, "bring me what I need. Unless you'd rather be the next broken body lying beneath my feet." Midoriya's gaze bore into the warden with an unyielding intensity, his tone now calm but menacing. "And one more thing," he added, lifting his restrained wrists slightly. "Remove these cuffs. They itch a lot." The warden hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he weighed his options. Every instinct screamed at him to obey, to avoid becoming another casualty under Midoriya's terrifying resolve. But protocol and fear clashed in his mind, leaving him frozen. Midoriya's patience waned as he noticed the warden's hesitation. His expression darkened, his voice dropping into a cold, threatening whisper. "Unless you'd like a demonstration of what happens when I get uncomfortable." The warden gulped, his fear overwhelming any sense of protocol. With shaky hands, he pulled out the key, approaching Midoriya with a reluctance born of terror. He couldn't shake the feeling that removing those cuffs would unleash a storm far beyond anything the prison had ever contained. As the cuffs fell to the ground with a heavy clink, Midoriya twisted his body slightly and approached the warden. His eyes remained cold, dark, and emotionless. The warden, trembling with fear, took a step back, but Midoriya was faster. With a sudden, brutal movement, he grabbed the warden's arm and twisted it in an unnatural direction. A sickening crack echoed through the room as the warden cried out in pain, his face contorted in agony. Midoriya's expression remained unchanged, as though this was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. "You're lucky I don't feel like doing worse," Midoriya spoke, his voice chilling and detached. "Now, remove my cuffs and get me my things, before I decide to tear apart more than just your arm." The warden, gasping for breath and trying to regain his composure, shakily nodded, doing his best to remain calm as he fumbled with the cuffs. The pain from his dislocated arm was excruciating, but the terror of what Midoriya was capable of made him work faster. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable as he complied with Midoriya's command. Midoriya watched with amusement as the warden scrambled to do his bidding, fully aware of the power he now wielded. "Good," Midoriya said coldly. "Now, get to work." Midoriya made his way through the dim corridors of the prison until he reached the isolated cell where Stain, the infamous hero killer, was held. The room was silent, save for the sound of chains clinking as Stain sat in a meditative pose, his sharp eyes flickering open as he sensed Midoriya's approach. Without preamble, Midoriya spoke, his voice cold and steady. "Teach me the way of the assassin. I know who you are, an S-rank assassin, the very best at what you do." Stain's eyes narrowed as he studied Midoriya, intrigued but cautious. "Why would you want to learn that path?" he asked, his tone filled with suspicion and a hint of amusement. "A path that requires true conviction, a willingness to cast aside what's left of your old self." Midoriya's gaze was intense, filled with a mix of darkness and determination. "I've already lost everything. My mother, my freedom, my future. The world has taken everything from me, and now, it's my turn to take something back. I want to know how to make them pay, not as a hero, but as an avenger." Stain smirked, nodding slightly, seeing a kindred spirit in Midoriya's resolve. "Very well," he replied, his voice low but filled with a dark promise. "But remember, once you step onto this path, there's no turning back. The way of an assassin demands sacrifice. Are you ready to embrace that?" Without hesitation, Midoriya nodded. "I am." Stain's smirk widened, approval glinting in his eyes. "Then let the training begin." The dimly lit cell in Tartarus was oppressive, a cage for the most dangerous beings alive. The silence was broken only by the sound of chains clinking as Stain moved, his scarred face twisted into an amused smirk. Across from him, Izuku Midoriya stood like a statue. His emerald eyes were devoid of emotion, his posture unervingly calm for someone in such an unforgiving place. Stain's voice broke the silence, low and gravelly, filled with a mix of intrigue and menace. "You've got guts, Midoriya," he began, pacing in front of the boy. "But guts alone won't save you. Out there," he gestured to the unseen world beyond the cell. "Heroes, villains, monsters. They all want the same thing. Power. Control. They'll rip you apart without a second thought if you're weak. You want to destroy them. You want to survive. You need more than brute strength. You need to become a killer. And not just any killer. A predator who can use anything, everything as a weapon." Izuku didn't respond. His silence wasn't one of fear or hesitation but a cold, calculating patience. Stain's smirk widened. "No whining. You're ready for the method." He crouched and scratched a rough circle onto the concrete floor with a broken shard of metal. "Do you know what the Killer Peter SS rank method is?" Izuku's eyes flicked to the circle and then back to Stain. "It's the art of absolute efficiency," Stain explained, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "Peter was a killer from an era long forgotten, a man who could turn anything, even a blade of grass, into a weapon. His philosophy was simple. A true killer doesn't rely on tools, they rely on intent and the environment. You will learn this. You will 𝗵𝗃𝗲 it. And when you do, no one, not heroes, villains, or gods, will be able to stand against you. Lesson 1. The foundation of intent. Stain tossed a piece of chalk at Izuku's feet. The boy picked it up without hesitation, examining its brittle texture. "Chalk," Stain said, his tone mocking. "A child's toy. Useless, right? Wrong. In the hands of a killer, even this can end a life." The first step in the SS rank method is understanding that intent transforms the mundane into the deadly. Without warning, Stain lunged at Izuku, his chains clinking loudly as he closed the distance. Izuku instinctively stepped back, raising the chalk in a defensive gesture. "Wrong." Stain barked, striking the chalk from his hand with a single motion. "Never defend. Always attack. A killer doesn't react, they act." Izuku retrieved the chalk, his expression unchanging. He stood still for a moment, processing Stain's words. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged forward, aiming the chalk at Stain's throat. The hero killer sidestepped easily, his chains catching Izuku's arm and twisting it behind his back. "Better," Stain muttered, releasing him. "But you're still thinking like a hero. You hesitate. You aim to disable, not to kill. That hesitation will get you killed." Izuku rose to his feet, his emerald eyes glinting with a newfound understanding. He nodded silently. Lesson 2. The environment is your weapon. The next night, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 expanded the lesson. He scattered various objects across the cell, rusty nails, shards of broken concrete, even a single shoelace. A killer doesn't carry an arsenal, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 said. They are the arsenal. Everything around you is a weapon if you know how to use it. Izuku picked up the shoelace, his gaze thoughtful. This. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 chuckled darkly. Good question. A shoelace can choke a man if used right. It can trip them, bind their limbs, or even act as a sling for a heavier object. The weapon isn't the shoelace, it's you. Izuku didn't reply, but his grip on the shoelace tightened. Over the next hour, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 demonstrated how to use each item in the room. He showed Izuku how to sharpen a nail against the concrete to create a makeshift dagger, how to use the weight of a shard to break bones, and how to turn a corner of the cell into a deadly trap. Adaptation is key, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 emphasized. The environment will always change. A true killer doesn't rely on familiarity. They see opportunity in chaos. Lesson 3. The Predator's Eye. By the third week, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 introduced the most critical part of the method, understanding the opponent. You've learned how to use your surroundings, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 said, pacing the cell. Now, you'll learn how to use your enemies against themselves. He crouched in front of Izuku, his scarred face inches away. A predator doesn't strike blindly. They observe, calculate, and then kill. The way they breathe, the way they stand, the way their eyes flicker, it all tells you how they'll move. Read them, Midoriya. See them before they see you. To test this, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 attacked without warning. Each strike was swift and brutal, but his movements carried subtle patterns, flickers of his gaze, shifts in his stance. Izuku was forced to rely not on instinct but on observation. Over time, he began to notice the signs, the slight tightening of 𝗧𝗍𝗃's muscles before a lunge, the faint twitch of his fingers before a feint. By the end of the lesson, Izuku had not only dodged several attacks but had countered one, grazing 𝗧𝗍𝗃's arm with a shard of concrete. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 grinned, blood dripping from the shallow wound. Now you're thinking like a predator. Next day in the dimly lit halls of Tartarus, Midoriya sat atop a crude throne of metal and chains, flanked by guards who seemed more nervous than protective. The echoes of footsteps reached him, and he turned his gaze toward the approaching figure. The guards stiffened as 𝗳𝗏𝗏 emerged, his ominous presence filling the room. There was a strange silence as he looked upon Midoriya, his eyes gleaming with a hidden intent. 𝗳𝗏𝗏's voice was smooth, almost cordial as he spoke. Well, the new king of Tartarus. Or should I say, Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya narrowed his eyes, reading between the lines. 𝗳𝗏𝗏 wasn't here just to acknowledge his strength or position in the prison. There was something else, a pull of familiarity in his voice, something beyond mere curiosity. Get to the point, Midoriya said coldly, not one to indulge in 𝗳𝗏𝗏's games. Why are you really here? A faint smile crossed 𝗳𝗏𝗏's lips, the type that never reached his eyes. Oh, I am here for a reason, Izuku. But perhaps not one you expect. Midoriya's gaze sharpened, his eyes narrowing. Stop speaking in riddles. 𝗳𝗏𝗏's composure didn't falter. He took a step closer, almost paternal in his demeanor, his voice lowered but steady. I wanted to see the young man you've become. After all, it's been some time since I last laid eyes on my own flesh and blood. For a moment, the weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, cold and unforgiving. Midoriya's mind raced, and he felt his hands tighten at the sides of the throne, nails digging into the metal. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a dangerous intensity behind his eyes. You're lying, Midoriya replied flatly, though something within him was shaken. No, Izuku, 𝗳𝗏𝗏 replied, his voice surprisingly soft, almost regretful. Not this time. The truth was withheld to give you the life of a hero, away from me. But destiny brings us together. Midoriya's mind spun as he tried to reconcile this claim with everything he knew. If you think calling me son will get me on your side, you're a fool. 𝗳𝗏𝗏 chuckled, an eerie sound that sent shivers down the spines of those nearby. I never said I expected you to be swayed. But I wanted you to know. My legacy flows within. You, even if you don't want to acknowledge it. Midoriya clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, every instinct in him rejecting the idea. Your legacy means nothing to me. You're a monster. Whatever BLD you claim to share with me, it doesn't change who I am. All for one nodded as though he'd anticipated the response. And yet, here you are, rising to power, commanding fear and respect. You are more like me than you realize. Midoriya's glare was icy, but there was no hesitation in his voice as he replied. I'll never become what you are. All for one's expression shifted, a strange mix of pride and amusement. We'll see, Izuku. We'll see if the path you walk remains your own, or if, in time, you find yourself drawn to mine. With that, he turned, his dark silhouette blending into the shadows, leaving Midoriya to process his words alone. As All for One's words faded into the darkness, he paused and looked back, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. And Izuku, what about Inko? Are you planning to ignore her final wish? Midoriya's heart skipped a beat, his hands involuntarily gripping the armrests of his makeshift throne. The memory of his mother's face, her last words, cut through him like a blade. Destroy everything, Izuku. Her voice echoed in his mind, filled with pain, bitterness, and desperation. All for One's tone softened, almost feigning sympathy. Her last wish. So simple, yet so powerful. She wanted you to tear this world down, to make them all pay. He let the words hang, studying Midoriya's expression. Have you forgotten already? Midoriya's eyes darkened, his gaze falling to the ground as memories of his mother flooded his thoughts. The agony she endured, the world that turned its back on her, the quiet, seething anger she hid behind gentle smiles. Her last words weren't born of malice, but of grief, of feeling betrayed and helpless. That grief, that desperation, was now rooted deep in his own heart. What about her ashes? All for One continued, pushing further, his voice a mixture of mockery and venom. Did they ever send them to you? Did those so-called heroes show any respect? Or did they just sweep it under the rug like everything else? Midoriya felt something snap within him. His jaw tightened, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, suppressing the surge of anger rising in his chest. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but simmering with rage. They didn't send anything. They discarded her. Like she meant nothing. All for One's smile twisted pleased. Then you understand, don't you? The world she despised, the people who wronged her. They deserve nothing less than what she asked of you. Her wish. It's still waiting to be fulfilled. Midoriya's gaze hardened, an intense resolve settling within him. The weight of his mother's words, her last wish, was now etched into his heart as an oath. Destroy everything. With one final glance, All for One stepped back into the shadows, leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts and a choice, to honor his mother's final wish, no matter the cost. Izuku's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with suspicion. Why did you call me here, old man? All for One let a quiet chuckle escape, though his gaze remained deadly serious. I brought you here, Izuku, because I believe it's time you inherit my quirk, All for One. Midoriya stiffened. The very quirk that made this man a living nightmare, a legend of power and control. It was a gift with more darkness than he'd ever thought of wielding. But there's more, All for One continued, his eyes gleaming as he held Midoriya's gaze. Your true quirk, the one you should have had from the beginning, elementalist. I blocked it, knowing your young body was too fragile to handle its power back then. But now you're more than ready. The words hit Izuku like a shockwave. A quirk he'd never known he had, locked away this entire time. Elementalist. The very name radiated strength, the kind of power he'd always dreamed of having, of unleashing without constraint. All for One watched as the realization dawned on him. You're angry, Izuku. You want to change this society, to tear down everything that wronged you and your mother. You can do it with All for One. But if you truly want to fulfill her last wish, you'll need more than rage. You'll need to wield both your elementalist abilities and my power. To destroy this rotten society, you'll have to do things differently. Izuku's gaze was intense, his mind racing. You blocked my real quirk all this time. And now you want me to inherit the very thing that gave you power. But what do you get out of this? 𝗵𝗃 leaned forward, his voice a dark murmur. Because the world has lost sight of true strength, Izuku. And because I see in you the will to reshape it, to lead it in a new direction. The world betrayed you, stripped you of everything. Isn't it time you made them remember what real power is? Izuku's expression hardened, the weight of his mother's final wish echoing in his mind. To honor her, to create change, maybe he did need to wield more than his own strength. Maybe he needed 𝗵𝗃's power to make this twisted society face justice. The path was brutal, but the promise of that power. It was almost impossible to resist. What do I have to do? He asked, his voice steady but charged with fierce resolve. 𝗵𝗃 smiled, satisfied, seeing the spark of ambition and vengeance in his eyes. 𝗵𝗃 continued, his voice surprisingly calm. If you're angry about the quirk blocking, know this. It wasn't just my decision. Your mother, 𝗵𝗃, was terrified for you. She knew my true identity, and she understood the weight of power, even if she hated me for it. She worried about what that quirk could do to you at such a young age. Izuku's eyes flickered, conflicting emotions surfacing. He could hardly imagine his mother having known any of this, much less trusting 𝗵𝗃 enough to let him block his quirk. She was scared that power would consume you, that you'd hurt yourself in ways you couldn't understand. 𝗵𝗃's tone softened just a bit. 𝗵𝗃. She loved you more than anything. Enough that she was willing to let her son grow up without ever knowing his true power if it meant keeping you safe. Izuku clenched his fists, his anger somewhat tempered by the thought of his mother's worry. He could feel her fear and love through 𝗵𝗃's words, and it struck a nerve, leaving him with an unsettling mix of resentment and sadness. She'd been protecting him even in ways he'd never known. You had no right, he murmured, voice low but with a dangerous edge. Perhaps, 𝗵𝗃 conceded, a slight nod as if acknowledging the pain he'd caused. But you have that power now, and her fears are no longer your burden to bear. You're ready to use it in a way she wouldn't have imagined. For the change she would have wanted for you, and perhaps for more. Izuku's anger didn't fade entirely, but now it was focused, sharpened by understanding. His mother had tried to protect him, even if it meant aligning with someone she detested. 𝗵𝗃's words struck Izuku like a hammer, heavy and unrelenting. Understand this, Izuku, he continued, his tone sincere in a way that felt foreign, even unsettling. Your mother. She sacrificed her career, her ambitions, everything she'd worked so hard to build, just to raise you. She was brilliant. I saw her casework, her answer sheets, her court battles. She was a natural, one of the best. If she had wanted, she could have been one of the country's most revered judges or a renowned lawyer. He paused, letting that sink in. But she chose you. Every time. Izuku's mind flashed back to the framed degree in their modest apartment, to the way his mother sometimes looked at it, a small, wistful smile on her face. She'd never once complained, never once hinted at regret. She'd simply poured everything into raising him. She was exceptional, Izuku, 𝗵𝗃 continued, his voice softer. And if there's a part of you that truly wants to honor her, to avenge the pain and injustice she suffered, then hear me out. His voice, always laced with manipulative charm, softened in a way Izuku had never heard before. Not as a villain. Not as the man the world calls a monster. But as your mother's husband. As the man who once held her trust. For her sake, give me a chance to guide you. Izuku's fists trembled, his heart a storm of emotions, rage, grief, and something harder to define. 𝗵𝗃 had been everything he despised, everything his mother had once shielded him from. But now, as he stood there, looking into the eyes of the man who'd loved her in his own twisted way, he felt a pull, a deep, unyielding weight in his chest. Izuku's voice was low, almost a whisper. What would you have me do for her? 𝗵𝗃 met his gaze, unwavering. Rise to the heights she dreamed of for you. Take the power to change this world, to root out the decay and bring forth a new order. This society is broken, Izuku, and you can be the one to rebuild it. For her. For everything she sacrificed. Izuku took a slow, deep breath, the weight of his mother's legacy settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about carrying on the strength, love, and fierce protection she'd shown him all his life. And if that meant listening to 𝗓𝗋, even just this once, then perhaps he owed her that much. Izuku's voice, cold and steely, cut through the silence like a blade. "Give this world the pain they gave her," he murmured, his gaze hardening. "100 times worse than they gave to us." 𝗓𝗋's eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction, sensing the unyielding resolve in Izuku. "Exactly," he replied, a subtle smile on his lips. "They took everything from her, from us. Now, it's time they understand what true suffering feels like." Izuku's fists clenched, a storm of emotion threatening to break free. "They wanted me to be powerless. They thought they could silence her, cast her aside. I'll make them regret every second of that." 𝗓𝗋 nodded approvingly, his voice soft but laced with venom. "And they will. Through you, they'll know the consequences of underestimating her son." He took a step closer. "Together, we'll dismantle this society that breeds hypocrisy and cruelty." Izuku's jaw tightened, the image of his mother's gentle smile flashing in his mind. She had sacrificed so much for him, sheltered him from darkness, even as it seeped into her own life. And now, he would return that devotion in the only way he knew how, by giving them all a taste of the fear, the helplessness, the agony that she had endured. "For her," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They'll pay. Every single one of them." The flickering lights of Tartarus cast long, uneven shadows on the damp walls. Izuku Midoriya sat cross-legged on the cold floor of his cell, his mind honed to a razor's edge from the brutal training Stain had subjected him to. Yet, the next lesson would take him beyond the realm of instinct and precision. It would demand something far deeper, the complete acceptance of his own darkness. Stain, ever the embodiment of conviction, stood before Izuku. His presence was an oppressive weight, his scarred face twisted into a grim mask. But there was no malice in his gaze, only cold understanding. "You've learned to kill," Stain began, his voice low and deliberate. "You've mastered the tools, the instincts, the execution. But that's only half of the transformation. A true killer doesn't just act, they become. The darkness isn't something you wield. It's something you are." Izuku's emerald eyes, now devoid of their former light, met Stain's unflinchingly. "I understand," he said, his tone as cold and empty as the prison walls around them. "No," Stain snapped, shaking his head. "You don't. Not yet. But you will." Lesson 1. Understanding the darkness. The first step was comprehension. Stain led Izuku into a deeper part of the prison, a place where the screams of the 𝗳𝗏𝗏 echoed endlessly, their anguish a constant reminder of the cost of weakness. "This is where the worst are kept," Stain explained, gesturing to the cells lining the walls. "Killers. Betrayers. Monsters. But do you know what separates them from you, Midoriya?" Izuku glanced at the shadowy figures behind the bars, their eyes glinting with malice. "What?" "Fear," Stain said, his voice a growl. "They fear their own darkness. They act because they're afraid. But you must embrace it. Accept it fully. Only then will you be truly free." The lesson was not taught through words alone. Stain forced Izuku to confront the prisoners, each one a reflection of what he could become if he failed. There were men who had killed for greed, for vengeance, for sport. Their eyes burned with madness, their actions driven by desperation. "You're not like them," Stain said as they returned to their cell. "Your darkness isn't a weakness. It's your strength. Embrace it, and no one will be able to stop you." Lesson 2. Confronting the self. The next step was internal. Stain presented Izuku with a cracked mirror, its jagged edges reflecting a distorted image of the boy. "Look at yourself," Stain ordered, his tone harsh. "What do you see?" Izuku stared into the glass, his expression unreadable. "I see emptiness." "Good," Stain said, his lips curling into a smirk. "Now fill it. The darkness isn't just about what you've lost. It's about what you'll become. Every scar, every shadow, it's all part of you. Accept it. Own it." To force the confrontation, 𝗧𝗍𝗍 used psychological tactics. He whispered doubts and fears into Izuku's ear, forcing him to relive the moments that had broken him: Bakugo's bullying, his mother's tears, the crushing weight of powerlessness. At first, the memories threatened to overwhelm him. But slowly, Izuku began to reshape them. The pain became fuel, the fear a weapon. Each memory was no longer a source of weakness but a foundation for his transformation. Lesson 3. Living in the shadows. To teach Izuku how to live within the darkness, 𝗧𝗍𝗍 devised a series of exercises that blurred the line between reality and illusion. You must learn to move unseen, 𝗧𝗍𝗍 explained. To exist in the spaces between light and shadow. The darkness will hide you, but only if you embrace it fully. Izuku was tasked with navigating Tartarus unnoticed. Guards patrolled the halls, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Izuku had to slip past them without being seen, relying solely on his instincts and his understanding of the shadows. At first, he struggled. The guards were well trained, their movements precise. But with each attempt, Izuku grew more adept. He learned to anticipate their patterns, to blend into the darkness as if he were a part of it. By the end of the exercise, Izuku could move through the prison like a ghost, his presence undetectable even to the most vigilant guard. Lesson 4. The killer's resolve. The final lesson was the most brutal. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 brought in a prisoner, a man known for his cruelty and violence. "This is your test," 𝗧𝗍𝗍 said, handing Izuku a knife. "Kill him." The man sneered, his confidence evident as he sized up the young boy. But Izuku didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. The fight was short. Izuku's training had made him efficient, his strikes precise. The prisoner didn't stand a chance. When it was over, Izuku stood over the man's lifeless body, the knife dripping with blood. His expression was cold, emotionless. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 nodded in approval. "You didn't hesitate. You didn't falter. You've embraced the darkness, Midoriya. You're ready." The transformation complete. By the end of the training, Izuku was no longer the boy who had entered Tartarus. He was something else entirely, a weapon forged in shadows, tempered by pain, and sharpened by resolve. As he stood in the dim light of the prison, his green hair casting eerie reflections on the walls, Izuku's voice broke the silence. "I understand now," he said, his tone as cold as ice. "The darkness isn't my enemy. It's my ally. And I will use it to create a world where the weak no longer suffer." 𝗧𝗍𝗍 watched him with a mixture of pride and unease. "You've embraced it, Midoriya. But remember, the darkness is a double-edged sword. Wield it wisely or it will consume you." Izuku's eyes, devoid of warmth, met 𝗧𝗍𝗍's. "It won't consume me. I am the darkness." And with that, the boy who once dreamed of being a hero stepped fully into the shadows, his transformation complete. The final trial months of relentless training had honed Izuku Midoriya into something entirely unrecognizable. His once hopeful emerald eyes were now cold, calculating, and emotionless. Every muscle in his body, every thought in his mind, had been sculpted for one purpose: to kill without hesitation, to move with purpose, and to live in the shadows. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 observed him with a mix of pride and somber understanding. This was the last day. The culmination of all the lessons, the trials, and the pain. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 would now test Izuku to see if the boy had truly become what he needed to survive in the world. 𝗧𝗍𝗍's final words. The training room, a hollowed-out section of Tartarus untouched by light, had become their arena. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 stood on one side, armed with his blood red blades. Izuku stood on the other, empty-handed. "This is your final trial," 𝗧𝗍𝗍 said, his voice steady. "You've learned everything I could teach you: how to kill, how to move unseen, how to think like a predator. But now, you must prove that you can surpass me. Today, you are not my student. You are my enemy." Izuku nodded, his expression unreadable. "And what happens if I win?" 𝗧𝗍𝗍 smirked. "Then my work is done, and you are ready to walk your own path. And if I lose?" "You won't," 𝗧𝗍𝗍 said simply. The duel without warning, 𝗧𝗍𝗍 lunged forward, his blades slicing through the air with deadly precision. Izuku didn't flinch. He moved like a shadow, his body weaving through the attacks with effortless grace. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 pressed harder, his strikes faster and more unpredictable, but Izuku was always one step ahead. Every feint, every move, every calculated movement was met with an equal and opposite reaction. "You've learned well," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 growled, his voice laced with both frustration and pride. Izuku didn't respond. Words were unnecessary. His actions spoke for him. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, his hand darting out to disarm 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a brutal efficiency that left no room for error. The blade clattered to the ground, and 𝗧𝗵𝗲 found himself pinned, Izuku's knee pressed against his chest, his own blade now at his throat. "It's over," Izuku said coldly. For a moment, there was silence. Then 𝗧𝗵𝗲 let out a low chuckle. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with a strange satisfaction. "It is." Acknowledgement and farewell. Izuku stepped back, allowing 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to rise. The older man dusted himself off, his smirk never faltering. "You've surpassed me, Midoriya," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said, sheathing his blade. "You've become more than a killer. You've become a force. And now, you no longer need me." Izuku's gaze remained steady. "What now?" "Now, you walk your own path," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 replied. "But remember this, the darkness you've embraced will always demand something in return. Stay true to your purpose, or it will consume you." Izuku nodded. "I won't falter." "I know you won't," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 said. "That's why I chose you." Walking out of the shadows as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 turned to leave, Izuku stood alone in the dim light, his mind racing with possibilities. The boy who once dreamed of being a hero was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's parting words echoed in his mind. The world doesn't need another hero. It needs someone who can do what they can't. Someone like you. For the first time in months, Izuku allowed himself a small, bitter smile. His training was complete. The world had no idea what was coming. Few days later, as we see two guys in guard uniforms, 𝗧𝗬𝗧 one gun was black hair man with eyes like black 𝗧𝗪𝗏 and white pupils, and other is a blonde guy with glasses as he looks Korean by appearance. 𝗳𝗏 and 𝗬𝗃 to at the entrance to Tartarus, the infamous prison housing the world's deadliest criminals. The dim lighting reflected off their sharp features, with 𝗬𝗃 casually adjusting the sword strapped to his back while 𝗳𝗏 strode forward with an air of authority. Both exuded an aura of confidence, bordering on arrogance, as they made their way toward the core of the prison. Their target was the so-called King of Tartarus. The rumors painted him as a young man who had single-handedly subdued hundreds of villains within the prison, carving out his throne from chaos and fear. 𝗳𝗏 was intrigued, not just by the title but by the idea of testing this supposed king. As they walked into the cell block, the sight before them was both intimidating and surreal. Izuku Midoriya sat atop a pile of unconscious or groaning villains, their defeated forms sprawled around the floor. His posture was relaxed, but his piercing green eyes were devoid of emotion, staring coldly at the two newcomers. Despite the chaos around him, his presence radiated calm depths, as though he was utterly untouchable. "So, you two must be the new guards," Midoriya said, his voice low and indifferent. He tilted his head slightly, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "I hope you're better than the last ones. Let's just say they didn't last long." 𝗳𝗏 smirked at the challenge. "I didn't come here to guard you, kid. I came to see if you're worth my time." He cracked his knuckles, stepping closer. "You're the so-called King of Tartarus. Let's see if you live up to the name." 𝗬𝗏 chuckled from behind, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "𝗳𝗏, you sure this is worth it? He looks scrawny, but I guess looks can be deceiving." Midoriya didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his position slightly, his gaze never leaving 𝗳𝗏. "You talk too much," he said flatly. "If you want to test me, go ahead. But don't hold back. I don't want to be disappointed." 𝗳𝗏's smirk widened as he lunged forward without hesitation, aiming a powerful punch at Midoriya's chest. The blow connected, but instead of the satisfying sound of impact, 𝗳𝗏 felt a jarring resistance. It was as though he had struck solid steel. Midoriya didn't even flinch. 𝗵𝗃 muttered, shaking his hand as though testing his knuckles. "Not bad. Your body's tougher than I thought." Is that all? Midoriya asked coldly, rising to his feet in one fluid motion. His movements were unhurried, but there was an unmistakable menace in the way he carried himself. 𝗬𝗧 stepped forward, drawing his sword in a smooth, practiced motion. The blade gleamed under the dim light as he pointed it at Midoriya. "Let me try," he said, his voice filled with amusement. "If your bones are as tough as they say, let's see how they hold up against this." He slashed at Midoriya, the blade moving with deadly precision. But as the sword made contact with Midoriya's forearm, it stopped abruptly, sparks flying from the impact. 𝗬𝗧 stared at the blade in disbelief. It hadn't even scratched him. "Impossible," 𝗬𝗧 muttered, pulling back and inspecting his weapon. The edge was slightly chipped. "What the hell are you made of?" Midoriya glanced at the faint mark on his arm, then back at 𝗬𝗧. "You'll need more than that to hurt me," he said, his tone as emotionless as ever. 𝗓𝗏 stepped in again, this time aiming a series of rapid punches at Midoriya's torso. Each strike was powerful enough to shatter concrete, but Midoriya absorbed them all without budging. He countered with a swift elbow strike to 𝗓𝗏's ribs, sending the larger man skidding back several feet. "You're strong," 𝗓𝗏 admitted, his tone laced with genuine respect. He wiped a bit of blood from the corner of his mouth and grinned. "But strength alone doesn't make you a king." Midoriya stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto 𝗓𝗏's. "I don't care about being a king," he said. "I care about surviving. And if you think you can teach me something useful, prove it." 𝗓𝗏's grin widened. "Oh, I like you, kid. You've got potential. But if you want my training, you're going to have to earn it." 𝗬𝗧 sheathed his sword, his earlier arrogance replaced with curiosity. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," he said. "This kid's tougher than he looks." Midoriya smirked faintly, the first hint of emotion breaking through his cold exterior. "If you think you can push me harder than I've already been pushed, you're welcome to try. But don't waste my time." 𝗓𝗏 chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "Oh, trust me. You won't regret this." The three of them stood in the dimly lit cell block, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The king of Tartarus had found new challengers, and perhaps new mentors. As Shogun looking at him as he said, "Well, Izuku Midoriya, you are going to be my greatest masterpiece." 𝗓𝗏 leaned against a beam in the expansive underground training hall, his piercing eyes never leaving Midoriya. The air was heavy with the sound of fists smashing into metal, solid, relentless, and unyielding. A battered old refrigerator, its surface marred with deep dents and scratches, stood as Midoriya's opponent for the day. His bloodied knuckles struck with unwavering rhythm, each impact reverberating through the hall. "Pain is the best teacher," 𝗓𝗏 remarked, his tone a mix of amusement and challenge. "It either breaks you or makes you unshakable. Right now, I need to know what kind of man you are, kid." Midoriya didn't respond, his focus razor-sharp. His breathing was laboured, his muscles screamed for rest, but his mind refused to waver. With an almost mechanical precision, he raised his fist again and drove it into the twisted metal. 𝗬𝗧, sitting casually on a stack of mats nearby, twirled a wooden sword in his hands as he watched. "You know, 𝗓𝗏," he said with a smirk, "at this rate, the fridge might hold up better than the kid." 𝗓𝗏 glanced at 𝗬𝗧 with a faint chuckle. If he falls apart, he wasn't worth the effort. But if he keeps going... He returned his gaze to Midoriya, whose strikes only grew fiercer. "He'll become a masterpiece." The first few weeks were nothing short of hell. 𝗓𝗏's training philosophy was brutal: shatter the limits of the body and mind to forge something unbreakable. "Strength isn't given," 𝗓𝗏 told Midoriya on the first day. "It's earned. And the price is everything you think you have." Morning sessions began with grueling endurance exercises. Midoriya was made to carry heavy chains wrapped around his torso, dragging massive tires across uneven terrain. 𝗓𝗏 insisted on uphill sprints, each run punctuated by Midoriya collapsing from exhaustion, only for 𝗓𝗏 to bark orders for him to get back up. "Your body is a tool," 𝗓𝗏 said, walking alongside him during one particularly brutal drill. "And tools are useless if they break under pressure. Harden it. Make it unyielding." Midoriya gritted his teeth, hauling himself to his feet despite the weight pulling him down. His cold, focused expression didn't falter. By the third week, 𝗀 introduced wall climbs with nothing but bare hands, punishing Midoriya for every slip or hesitation. His palms were raw and bleeding, but he didn't stop. 𝗀 often watched from the sidelines, occasionally tossing in snide remarks. "You're really pushing him, 𝗀. You sure he won't break?" 𝗀 didn't bother to respond, his attention fixed on Midoriya. He's not the type to break. He'll adapt or die trying. When 𝗀 deemed Midoriya's physical foundation strong enough, the focus shifted to technique. Each day brought the introduction of a new martial art, and each night was spent drilling it into perfection. "This is Kyokushin karate," 𝗀 explained one day, his stance low and powerful. With a single devastating low kick, he sent a training dummy skidding across the floor. It's all about brute force. Every strike must be a knockout. Midoriya imitated the move, his kick slamming into the dummy with impressive force. The dummy quivered but didn't topple. "Not bad," 𝗀 said, stepping forward. "But your balance is off." Again. 4 hours, Midoriya practiced under 𝗀's scrutinizing eye. The faintest mistake was met with immediate correction. And when the sun rose the next day, they moved on to the next art. Shotokan karate, judo, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, and more, all were drilled into Midoriya with relentless precision. "Most people spend years mastering just one of these," 𝗀 remarked, watching Midoriya execute a flawless combination of strikes and grapples. "But he's different. It's like he's downloading them into his brain." 𝗀's gaze remained locked on Midoriya, his expression unreadable. "He's not just learning," he said quietly. "He's evolving. All the martial arts he learned by copying 𝗀 and perfecting it Aikido, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, like normal jiu-jitsu, judo jiu-jitsu, karate Kyokushin, karate Shotokan, karate Goju-ryu, karate Isshin-ryu, karate Shito-ryu, karate Shorin-ryu, and karate Wado-ryu, kickboxing, boxing, kung fu, Muay Thai, Sambo, sumo, MMA mixed martial arts, taekwondo, systema, lucha libre, Kali 𝗧𝗵𝗃/𝗧𝗵𝗲, and Tai Chi. But martial arts alone weren't enough. 𝗀 designed a regimen of extreme strength and endurance training to push Midoriya beyond human limits. "Punch through the steel," 𝗀 ordered one day, pointing to a reinforced steel slab set up in the training hall. Midoriya's knuckles were already raw, but he didn't hesitate. He struck the steel with all his might, the impact sending a painful shock up his arm. "Again," 𝗀 said, his voice cold. The first cracks appeared after the 10th punch. By the 20th, the steel began to bend. "That's it," 𝗀 said, a faint smirk on his lips. "Pain is temporary. Power is forever." Each task was more punishing than the last. One day, Midoriya was made to lift boulders. The next, he was tasked with running laps around the hall while dragging a sled loaded with weights. And always, 𝗀's voice pushed him further. "Everything in life fights back," 𝗀 said during one particularly grueling session. "If you want to win, you have to hit harder, move faster, and endure longer. There are no shortcuts." Midoriya's body screamed for mercy, but his mind was a fortress. His cold, focused determination never wavered. On the last day of training, 𝗀 and 𝗀 stood in the center of the hall, their postures relaxed but their eyes sharp. "This is it," 𝗀 said, his tone heavy with anticipation. "Everything you've learned, everything you've endured, it's time to show me what you've become." Midoriya stepped forward, his expression as icy and unreadable as ever. Without warning, he launched himself at 𝗀 with explosive speed. 𝗀 blocked the first strike, but the sheer force of it pushed him back a step. Midoriya's movements were a terrifying blend of every style he had learned, brutal, precise, and unrelenting. "You're holding back," 𝗀 said, parrying a rapid series of punches. "Stop treating me like I'm fragile." Midoriya's next attack was faster, his strikes flowing seamlessly from one technique to the next. A feint with his left hand, followed by a devastating spinning kick, caught 𝗀 off guard. The impact sent him stumbling, and before he could recover, Midoriya delivered a perfectly timed sweep that knocked him to the ground. 𝗀 lay there for a moment, breathing heavily. Then, to 𝗀's astonishment, he laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh that echoed through the hall. "You did it," 𝗳𝗃 said, climbing to his feet. You're not just my student anymore. You're my greatest work. My masterpiece. Midoriya stood silently, his cold eyes locked on 𝗳𝗃. 𝗬 smirked from the sidelines, shaking his head. Guess you're out of a job, 𝗳𝗃, he teased. 𝗳𝗃's grin widened. Not a chance. There's always more to learn. But for now. He stepped closer to Midoriya, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You're ready for whatever comes next. Midoriya's lips curled into the faintest smirk, his icy demeanor unshaken. I was born ready. Midoriya walked out of the training hall that day a different man. Hardened, unyielding, and armed with skills that would make him a force of nature. Behind him, 𝗳𝗃 and 𝗬𝗃 watched with a mixture of pride and awe. What have we unleashed? 𝗬𝗃 muttered. 𝗳𝗃's smirk returned. Not what? And the world isn't ready for him. Afterwards, Midoriya stood in front of the mirror, his reflection almost unrecognizable. The face staring back at him was sharp, chiseled, and utterly intimidating. His jet-black hair now had an untamed yet refined look, and his piercing eyes held a depth that was both commanding and eerie. His physique was now the embodiment of discipline and strength, honed from the brutal training 𝗳𝗃 had subjected him to. He slowly flexed his fingers, the scars from his past life barely visible on his skin. The voice that escaped his lips was no longer the timid tone of a boy striving to prove himself. It was deep, calm, and calculated, reminiscent of Sung Jinhwa's measured cadence. 𝗳𝗃 stood beside him, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. I told you, didn't I? The old you needed to die. What you see now, this is my masterpiece. He gestured toward Midoriya with a slight nod. You're no longer a symbol of weakness. You're the predator in a world of prey. Midoriya turned his gaze toward 𝗳𝗃, his new voice resonating through the room. This transformation. It's not just the appearance, is it? You've made sure I have no choice but to embrace what comes next. 𝗳𝗃's smirk deepened. Exactly. A new face, a new voice, and the strength to match. No one will recognize you, not even those who thought they knew you best. But more importantly, no one will dare stand against you. Midoriya nodded slowly, his expression cold, unreadable. And the doctor? 𝗳𝗃 chuckled. He did an excellent job. You might want to thank him, if you can find him. He prefers to disappear after making his miracles. Midoriya's lips curled into a faint, dark smile. I have no need for gratitude. This is a means to an end. Nothing more. 𝗳𝗃 clapped a hand on Midoriya's shoulder, the force of it almost knocking the air out of the room. That's what I like to hear. You're no longer Izuku Midoriya, the boy who couldn't fight back. From today, you're the king of predators. A man forged in BLD and discipline. The scene shifted as Midoriya stepped outside the training compound for the first time since his transformation. The air felt different, colder. The eyes of everyone around him lingered on his new form, their awe and fear evident. 𝗳𝗃 leaned against the doorway, watching as Midoriya began to adapt to his surroundings. As Midoriya strode forward, a group of recruits training nearby froze, their gazes following his every move. One of them whispered, "Is that the guy 𝗳𝗃's been working on? He doesn't even look human anymore." 𝗳𝗃 overheard the comment and grinned. Human? He's beyond that now. Midoriya's voice broke through the murmurs, silencing everyone instantly. The whispers won't help you survive. Focus on yourselves, or you'll crumble under the weight of mediocrity. The recruits quickly returned to their training, their faces pale. 𝗳𝗃 laughed softly, muttering to himself, "Yeah, he's going to be something else." Later that evening, Midoriya stood alone in the shadows of the compound. His reflection in a broken window stared back at him, the moonlight accentuating every sharp angle of his new visage. The voice that came from his lips, deep and commanding, echoed in the silence. This face, this voice, this strength, all tools for what's to come. The weak must be reminded of their place. And I'll be the one to remind them. From the shadows, 𝗳𝗃's voice interrupted his thoughts. And what will you do with this power, Midoriya? Midoriya didn't turn to face him. What I was always meant to do. Become the nightmare they fear and the shadow they can't escape. 𝗳𝗃 chuckled. Good. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Welcome to the new you. Afterwards, in a tight security room, as 𝗳𝗏𝗺𝗺's trembling hand hovered over Midoriya, the atmosphere grew heavy with a palpable energy. Izuku's sharp, determined gaze pierced through the dimly lit chamber. His eyes, once a vibrant green filled with youthful hope, had now transformed, reflecting the darkness he had embraced. The sclera of his eyes had turned an inky black, while his pupils shone a stark, almost ethereal white, radiating an unsettling aura of power. The tendrils of 𝗳𝗏𝗺's power coiled like serpents, reaching into Midoriya's core. His body trembled as the quirks poured into him, one after another, an overwhelming torrent of strength, memories, and raw potential. Pain rippled through his frame, his muscles convulsing as his mind raced to accommodate the sheer magnitude of the transfer. And yet, amidst the chaos within him, his expression remained eerily calm, a sinister smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Midoriya's voice, deeper and colder than ever, echoed in the chamber. So, this is it. The culmination of your power, your legacy, and your ambition. Now mine. 𝗳𝗏𝗺 chuckled weakly, his body visibly drained from the process. Yes, Izuku. Feel it. The power to reshape the world, to dominate and destroy as you see fit. How does it feel, my heir? Izuku raised a hand, flexing his fingers as a dark, crackling energy surrounded them. His black sclera and glowing white pupils seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the room. It feels liberating, he muttered, his voice carrying an edge of restrained fury and dark excitement. For the first time, I'm not bound by anyone's expectations. Not by heroes, not by society, not even by you. 𝗳𝗏𝗺 smirked faintly. Good. That's the mindset of a ruler. Midoriya's grin widened, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold confidence of someone who had finally grasped the destiny he believed he was meant for. He turned away from the weakened figure of 𝗳𝗏𝗺, his steps echoing as he began walking toward the exit. As he pushed the heavy doors open, the cool night air greeted him. He paused, gazing up at the sky with his unsettling new eyes. They reflected the moonlight, their eerie glow a testament to the transformation he had undergone. This power, he whispered, his voice low and menacing, isn't just for destruction. It's for creation, for reshaping this broken world into one where strength and ambition reign supreme. Memories of his past flashed through his mind. The ridicule, the rejection, the countless nights spent yearning for recognition. Those memories didn't hurt anymore, they fueled him. They were the foundation of his resolve. No more weakness, he muttered, clenching his fists. No more hypocrisy. The heroes and their flawed ideals. They'll all fall. I'll show them what true power looks like. His mind raced with plans. He thought of the quirks now residing within him, each one a piece of the arsenal he would use to obliterate the old world. First, I'll add them, he said aloud, his tone sharp with determination. I'll push each one to its limits and make them mine. Then, I'll tear apart their symbols of hope, starting with you. Hi. The age of false peace is over. He smirked, the black sclera of his eyes making the glow of his white pupils all the more striking in the shadows. They'll see me coming, but they won't be able to stop me. Not the heroes, not the villains, not anyone. For a moment, the streets were silent, save for the sound of his steady footsteps. The city slept, unaware of the storm that had just been unleashed. Izuku Midoriya, reborn as a harbinger of change, disappeared into the darkness, his plans etched clearly in his mind. The world will kneel, he murmured to himself, his voice dripping with quiet menace. Not because they fear me, but because they'll have no choice. As the surge of power finally settled within him, Izuku stood alone in the vast training room 𝗳𝗏𝗺 had prepared for him. The air was thick with the residue of energy from the quirk transfer, and his body still pulsed with raw, unrefined power. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool air, as his glowing white pupils scanned the room, his black sclera making them appear even more haunting. Time to see what I've inherited, he muttered to himself, rolling his shoulders as he stretched his arms, feeling the latent energy simmering beneath his skin. A single wave of his hand created a faint distortion in the air, a testament to the power coursing through him. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on the vast ocean of quirks within him, categorizing them, analyzing their potential, and feeling their essence. Opening his eyes, a sinister grin spread across his face. So many tools. So much potential. Let's organize this chaos. He conjured a notebook from nearby, a habit he hadn't yet abandoned, and began listing the quirks, testing them briefly to understand their capabilities. Each entry was accompanied by a sharp whisper, his voice carrying equal parts amazement and intent. Midoriya's list of all for one's quirks: decay, the ability to disintegrate anything he touches. So this is Shigaraki's infamous quirk. Absolute destruction at my fingertips. Super regeneration, rapid healing that allows his body to recover from almost any injury. A second chance in every fight. Perfect. Air cannon, the ability to release devastating blasts of compressed air. Perfect for long-range devastation. Warp gate, teleportation for himself and others over vast distances. Mobility and logistics secured. Hypertrophy, the ability to enlarge his muscles temporarily for enhanced strength. A simple, brutal solution. Search, a quirk that allows him to locate and analyze up to 100 people at once. Knowledge is power, and now I have both. Infrared vision, the ability to see in the dark and through obstacles. No shadows can hide my enemies. Impact recoil, a quirk that returns the force of any attack to its origin. They'll break themselves before they break me. Blade arms, the ability to transform his arms into sharp, deadly blades. Swift, silent, and deadly. Barrier, the ability to create near-impenetrable shields of energy. Defense to complement my offense. Enhancer, a quirk that boosts his physical strength and agility exponentially. Raw power when finesse won't do. Shockwave emission, generates seismic energy capable of creating devastating shockwaves. Earth-shattering destruction at will. Black tendrils, tendrils of energy for mid to long-range combat. Versatile and efficient. Energy manipulation, the ability to manipulate ambient energy and turn it into powerful attacks. Limitless potential for creativity in combat. Quirk nullification, the power to nullify the quirks of others temporarily. When their power fails, mine will still stand. Voice amplification, a quirk that lets him create sonic attacks with his voice. For when subtlety isn't needed. Telekinesis, the ability to control objects with his mind. Effortless control of the battlefield. Fire generation, the ability to produce and control flames. Burn them to ash if need be. Ice manipulation, control over ice to create structures, weapons, or immobilize opponents. The perfect complement to fire. Electric discharge, the ability to release electricity in devastating bursts. Stunning and destructive. Density control, the ability to make objects or even himself heavier or lighter. A tactical advantage at all times. Mind reading, a quirk that allows him to read the surface thoughts of others. They can't fight what I know before they do. Fear inducement, the ability to project intense fear into others. Even the strongest crumble under terror. Gravity manipulation, control over gravitational forces. The battlefield bends to my will. Izuku paused, surveying the notebook and his annotations. His breathing had steadied, and his mind was clearer than it had ever been. The sheer number of quirks at his disposal wasn't just overwhelming, it was exhilarating. Each one was a key to unlocking his ultimate plans. He chuckled softly, his voice cold and commanding. With this arsenal, I'll reshape the world. Heroes, villains, even society itself. None of them are ready for me. Closing the notebook, he stared at his reflection in the darkened glass of the training room, his black sclera and white pupils glowing faintly in the dim light. This was no longer the boy who once idolized heroes. This was someone else entirely, a harbinger of change and power beyond comprehension. This isn't just about strength, he whispered, his grin widening. It's about control. And I will control everything. The cold, oppressive silence of the maximum security prison was only broken by the sound of deliberate footsteps echoing through the dimly lit hallway. The guards stationed nearby barely spared a glance as the tall figure passed them, their faces pale and fearful. Izuku Midoriya, clad in a dark coat that billowed behind him, his black 𝗧𝗪𝗓 and glowing white pupils cutting through the gloom, moved forward with an air of absolute authority. As he reached the end of the hallway, he stopped in front of a thick steel door, its surface scratched and dented, a testament to the occupants' futile attempts at freedom. Overhaul, 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 sat hunched inside, his once pristine suit tattered, his hands gone as he stared at the floor. The man who once terrorized so many now looked small and broken. The sound of the lock clicking open made 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 look up, his eyes widening in shock. Standing before him was a figure he barely recognized. Izuku's face was unreadable, but his glowing eyes carried an intensity that sent a shiver down 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃's spine. "Midoriya," 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "What are you doing here?" Izuku stepped into the cell, the door slamming shut behind him. He said nothing at first, letting the oppressive silence weigh down on 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃. Finally he spoke, his voice cold and detached. "I'm here to take something from you, Overhaul. Something you don't deserve to have." 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃's confusion quickly turned to anger as he shot to his feet. "You think you can walk in here and threaten me? Do you know who I am? What I've done?" Izuku didn't respond with words. Instead, his hand shot forward, gripping 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 by the throat and slamming him into the wall with enough force to crack the concrete. 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 gasped, gasping at Izuku's hand, but it was like trying to move a steel vise. "I know exactly who you are," Izuku said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're the man who destroyed lives without a second thought. You think you're powerful, but you're nothing compared to me." His grip tightened, and 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃's struggles grew weaker. Without warning, Izuku released him, letting him crumple to the floor in a coughing heap. 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 barely had time to catch his breath before Izuku kicked him hard in the ribs, sending him sprawling. He landed with a groan, clutching his side, but Izuku wasn't done. He grabbed 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 by the collar, lifting him off the ground effortlessly. "You took away her freedom," Izuku growled, his mind flashing back to Eri and the horrors she endured. "You turned her life into a nightmare. This is the least you deserve." The beating that followed was brutal and unrelenting. Izuku didn't hold back, each punch and kick carrying the weight of his fury. Blood splattered against the walls and floor, 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃's cries of pain echoing through the cell. By the time Izuku stepped back, his breathing even and steady, 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 was barely conscious, slumped against the wall. But Izuku wasn't finished. He knelt beside 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃, placing a hand on his chest. A dark, ominous aura began to emanate from Izuku as he activated his newly acquired power. 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃's body convulsed as Izuku's hand glowed, the quirk overhaul being forcibly extracted from him. When it was over, 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 collapsed to the floor, his body limp and his eyes hollow. Izuku stood, flexing his fingers as he felt the power coursing through him. "This quirk. It's wasted on you," he said, his voice cold. "I'll use it for something greater than your twisted ideals." He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only briefly to glance back at 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃, who now sat slumped and broken in the corner of his cell, his once imposing presence reduced to nothing. "Sit here and rot," Izuku said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "It's more mercy than you deserve." The door slammed shut behind him, and as Izuku's footsteps faded down the hall, 𝗧𝗪𝗁𝗃 was left alone in the darkness, his body battered, his quirk stolen, and his spirit utterly crushed. In Muscular prison room the clash was inevitable. Muscular had long been a lingering stain on Izuku's memory, their first battle serving as a painful reminder of his limitations. Now, Midoriya returned, a completely different person, stronger, colder, and more calculating. As the door to Muscular's cell opened, the hulking brute grinned, his eyes lighting up with twisted glee. "Deku. Oh, I've been waiting for this. Ready for round 2. Izuku stepped inside, his gaze calm but icy. "This isn't a round, Muscular. It's the final act." Muscular lunged, his body already bulging with his quirk's power, but Izuku was faster. Effortlessly sidestepping the attack, Izuku delivered a devastating kick to Muscular's ribs, sending him crashing into the wall. "You're still just a brute with no strategy," Izuku said, his voice low. "But I'm not the same as I was back then." The battle was over almost as soon as it began. Izuku dismantled Muscular with precision, every punch and kick calculated to inflict maximum damage. The air crackled with dark energy as Izuku activated his quirk-stealing ability, placing his hand over Muscular's chest. The hulking man screamed as his power was ripped away from him, his once mighty frame now limp and powerless. As Muscular lay motionless on the floor, Izuku looked down at him with a mixture of contempt and closure. "This is for Kota," he muttered, turning and leaving without another word. Next day the clanging of metal doors echoed through Tartarus as Midoriya entered the dimly lit containment block. His imposing presence was enough to silence even the rowdiest prisoners, his black 𝗧𝗪𝗏 and white pupils glowing faintly in the darkness. Each step he took was deliberate, exuding authority as the self-proclaimed king of Tartarus. In one of the cells sat 𝗳𝗏𝗍𝗍𝗍, a former martial artist known for his chaotic disdain for the hero system. Despite the dire atmosphere of the prison, 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗍𝗪's expression was casual, almost jovial, as he leaned back against the wall with his legs crossed. When he spotted Midoriya, his grin widened. "So, you're the so-called king everyone talks about," 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗍𝗪 said, his voice booming through the cell. "You've got a reputation, I'll give you that. But tell me before we get to anything serious." He stood, cracking his knuckles, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "What kind of girls do you like?" Midoriya raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question, momentarily thrown off by the absurdity of it. He had been prepared for a fight, not a personal inquiry. Then his mind flickered back to one of the earlier cells he had visited, where he had beaten a particularly annoying prisoner into 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗄𝗏. On the floor of that cell, he had noticed a photo, a picture of a woman. The woman had caught his attention. She was tall, with a striking physique, a confident pose in a bikini, and, notably, a large, shapely figure. It wasn't a detail that normally stayed in his mind, but 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗍𝗪's strange question had brought it back. Midoriya's voice was cold and detached, but there was a trace of amusement in his tone as he answered, "Tall. Confident. With a big butt." There was a beat of silence before 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 burst out laughing, clapping his hands together. "Ha! A man of culture, I see," he roared. "I knew I'd like you. You've got good taste, king." Midoriya's expression didn't change, though he crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the wall. "Are we done with the small talk, or do you have more questions about my preferences?" 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 wiped a tear from his eye, still chuckling. All right. Straight to business, huh. I respect that. But you've intrigued me, Midoriya. A man who knows what he likes and isn't afraid to fight for it. Let's see if you're as strong as they say." Without warning, 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 launched himself at Midoriya, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. Midoriya anticipated the attack and sidestepped, his body reacting with calculated precision. 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 spun on his heel, aiming a powerful punch at Midoriya's ribs. The impact echoed through the corridor, but Midoriya barely flinched. "Not bad," Midoriya said, grabbing 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪's arm mid-swing and twisting it. "But strength alone won't get you anywhere." 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 grinned through the pain, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Good. Show me what you've got." He clapped his hands together, activating his quirk, Boogie Woogie. In an instant, their positions swapped, leaving 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 standing where Midoriya had been a second ago. Midoriya didn't hesitate. He had already studied 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪's ability and predicted the move. He lunged forward, his fist colliding with 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪's chest before the larger man could react. The force of the blow sent 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 skidding back, but he remained standing, laughing through gritted teeth. "You're no joke, king," 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪 admitted, rubbing his chest. "It's been a while since I had a real challenge." Midoriya tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "You're strong, 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪. But strength means nothing without purpose. Why do you fight?" 𝗳𝗏𝗧𝗪's laughter softened, replaced by a serious expression. "Because I hate this system. Heroes, villains, it's all a sham. They don't care about people like us. But you're different. I can see it in your eyes." Midoriya nodded, a rare flicker of approval in his cold demeanor. "Then fight with me, not against me." Together, we'll create a world where strength and conviction reign supreme. 𝗳𝗏 smirked, clapping his hands together once more. This time, it wasn't to attack. You've got a deal, King. Let's tear this system down. As the dust from their skirmish settled, 𝗳𝗏 stood with a mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. His towering frame was covered in sweat, his breath 𝗧𝗪𝗱 but steady. Midoriya, however, appeared almost untouched, his cold and calculating demeanor as unshaken as ever. He stepped closer to 𝗳𝗏, his black sclera and glowing white pupils locking onto 𝗳𝗏's gaze. Midoriya's voice, deep and commanding, carried a weight that silenced even the faintest echoes in the corridor. You're strong, 𝗳𝗏. Stronger than most I've encountered in this place. But strength without direction is meaningless. 𝗳𝗏 tilted his head, his ever-present grin returning. So what's this about, King? You trying to recruit me or just here to show off? Midoriya crossed his arms, his posture exuding authority. I'm here to make an offer. I'm building something bigger than heroes and villains, bigger than this corrupt system we're trapped in. I need people like you by my side. People with strength, conviction, and a disdain for the lies we've been fed. 𝗳𝗏 raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. I want you to be my first commander, Midoriya continued. Out of the 10 people I'll choose to stand at my side, I want you to be the first. Together, we'll bring down this system and reshape the world into one where true power and vision reign supreme. There was a pause as 𝗳𝗏 considered the offer. His gaze lingered on Midoriya, searching for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was a man with unwavering determination. Finally, a wide grin spread across 𝗳𝗏's face. You've got guts, King, 𝗳𝗏 said, clapping his hands together once more. The sound echoed through the corridor, but this time, there was no use of his quirk. All right, I'll bite. But if I'm going to follow you, I need to know one thing. Midoriya's expression remained unreadable. What's that? 𝗳𝗏's eyes gleamed with a mix of seriousness and mischief as he asked, What kind of world are you trying to create? Midoriya's response was immediate, his voice cold but resolute. A world where strength is the only currency that matters. A world where those with power can truly shape their destiny. No lies, no hypocrisy, just raw truth. 𝗳𝗏 let out a low chuckle. You've got a vision, I'll give you that. 𝗧𝗵𝗃. But let's get one thing straight, I don't follow weaklings. You'll have to keep proving you're worthy of being called king. Midoriya nodded, the faintest smirk playing at the corner of his lips. You'll find no weakness in me, 𝗳𝗏. Welcome to the start of something unstoppable. Aftermath with 𝗳𝗏 Aoi as his first commander, Midoriya's ambitions began to take shape. 𝗳𝗏's loyalty and raw power made him a formidable ally, and his unrelenting spirit ensured that he never backed down from a challenge. Together, they started laying the groundwork for a new era, one forged in strength, ambition, and the longing to shatter the chains of a broken system. The Tartarus gym was dimly lit, a sanctuary for the restless souls trapped within its walls. The clang of weights and the low hum of machines filled the air as Midoriya stood shirtless, his lean yet muscular physique glistening with sweat. His movements were precise, controlled, and methodical as he lifted a stack of weights far heavier than anyone in Tartarus dared to attempt. His black sclera and glowing white pupils gleamed ominously in the faint light. This wasn't mere training for Midoriya, it was preparation for the war he intended to wage. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his focus. He lowered the weights with a metallic clang, turning his head slightly. A woman stepped into view, her presence commanding and sharp. She had an air of deadly precision, her eyes cold yet assessing. Lady Nagant, Midoriya said flatly, recognizing her immediately. To what do I owe this visit? Nagant crossed her arms, leaning casually against a nearby pillar. I've been watching you, King of Tartarus. It's hard not to, considering the chaos you've stirred up around here. Midoriya stood, unfazed by her scrutiny. If you're here to challenge me, I suggest you think twice. I've no interest in pointless fights. A small smirk played on Nagant's lips. Relax, kid. I'm not here to fight you. In fact, I'm curious. You've been tearing through this place like a storm, taking quirks, building alliances. What's your endgame? Midoriya's eyes narrowed, and his voice turned cold and measured. To burn the current system to the ground and rebuild it in my image. This world is broken, and I'm the only one with the strength to fix it. 𝗫𝗫𝗁𝗃 chuckled softly. Big words for someone so young. But I can see it in your eyes. You mean every word. You remind me of myself before. Everything. Midoriya tilted his head slightly. And yet you're here. What do you want? 𝗫𝗁𝗃 stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. I've seen how corrupt the hero system is firsthand. I've been a pawn in their games, and I've killed in their name. But you're different. You're not hiding behind a mask of righteousness. You're honest about what you want, and I can respect that. So? Midoriya asked, his tone still cold. So, 𝗫𝗁𝗃 continued, I want in. You're going to need more than brute force and stolen quirks to take on the world. You'll need strategy, precision, and someone who knows how to navigate the system you're trying to destroy. Midoriya studied her for a moment, his piercing gaze analyzing every word, every movement. You want to join me? 𝗫𝗁𝗃 nodded. I do. But let's be clear, I'm not here to follow blindly. I'll fight by your side as long as your vision aligns with my own. The moment it doesn't, I won't hesitate to put a bullet between your eyes. A rare smirk appeared on Midoriya's face. Fair enough. But you should know, Lady 𝗫𝗁𝗃, if you ever aim that rifle at me, you won't get the chance to fire. 𝗫𝗁𝗃 smiled, a hint of amusement in her expression. I'd expect nothing less. Aftermath with Lady 𝗫𝗁𝗃 joining his ranks. Midoriya gained more than just another ally. He gained a strategist, an assassin, and someone who understood the flaws of the hero system from the inside out. Their alliance marked another step forward in his journey to reshape the world, each new recruit solidifying his path as the king of Tartarus. Meeting the lawyer Midoriya was sitting in his cell, sharpening his skills with a metal bar he'd bent into a makeshift training tool. The usual hum of Tartarus felt distant, his focus unshaken. Then came the sound of a guard's keys jangling, followed by a polite knock on the metal bars, a rare formality in a place like this. Midoriya, the guard said, his voice tinged with unease, you have a visitor. A lawyer. Midoriya's glowing white pupils shifted to the guard. A lawyer, he asked, his tone flat but with a flicker of intrigue. Yes. Says he's here on behalf of 𝗳𝗏. Midoriya stood slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. Take me to him. The meeting room was stark and sterile, a table and 2 chairs the only furniture present. Sitting in one of the chairs was a sharply dressed man in a tailored black suit, his hair slicked back and his demeanor calm yet imposing. A briefcase rested on the table in front of him. Midoriya entered, his gaze locking onto the man. The lawyer rose, offering a hand. Izuku Midoriya, I presume. Midoriya ignored the handshake, taking a seat instead. You're 𝗳𝗏𝗺's lawyer. What do you want? The man smirked slightly, sitting down and opening the briefcase. Not what I want, Mr. Midoriya. What your father wanted. My name is 𝗬𝗂𝗵𝗃. I've been Mr. Shigaraki's, your father's, legal representative for years. And now, I am here to fulfill his last wishes. Midoriya leaned back, his expression unreadable. Go on. 𝗬𝗂𝗁𝗃 slid a stack of documents across the table. Your father anticipated his eventual removal from the picture. As such, he arranged for all his remaining assets, both tangible and intangible, to be transferred to you. Midoriya raised an eyebrow. All his assets. Yes, 𝗬𝗁𝗃 confirmed, adjusting his glasses. His wealth, properties, hidden vaults, resources, and more importantly, his networks. These documents outline everything. Bank accounts, safe houses, access codes, and a comprehensive list of his associates. It's all yours now. Midoriya's eyes flickered with a hint of interest. And what's the catch? 𝗬𝗁𝗃 smiled. No catch. He believed in you, Mr. Midoriya. He believed you would carry on his legacy in ways even he couldn't. Consider this his parting gift. Midoriya glanced at the documents, then back at 𝗬𝗂𝗃. Are you part of this inheritance? I serve the heir to 𝗳𝗏, 𝗬𝗃 replied smoothly. As long as you lead, I will assist. My expertise is at your disposal. Midoriya smirked faintly, the first sign of emotion breaking through his cold demeanor. Efficient. I like that. Anything else? Kazuki reached into the briefcase again, pulling out a sealed envelope. This is a personal letter from your father. He instructed me to give it to you directly. Midoriya took the envelope, staring at it for a moment before tucking it into his pocket. I'll read it later. Kazuki nodded. As you wish. One last thing, your father mentioned that his legacy isn't just about power or wealth. He wanted you to surpass him in every way. To become more than just the king of Tartarus, but the ruler of a new era. Midoriya stood, gathering the documents. He'll get his wish. Now leave. Kazuki stood as well, bowing slightly. Of course. If you need me, you know how to reach me. As Kazuki Mori packed his briefcase to leave, Midoriya leaned forward in his chair, his black sclera and glowing white pupils locking onto the lawyer with unsettling intensity. Wait, Midoriya said, his voice calm but commanding, stopping Kazuki in his tracks. Kazuki turned back. Yes, Mr. Midoriya. Midoriya steepled his fingers, his posture exuding control. Before you go, tell me everything. What exactly have I acquired from my father? What types of people worked under him? And what kind of reach do his resources have, both here and outside the country? Kazuki smiled faintly, sensing the sharp intellect behind the question. Of course. Allow me to summarize. He opened the briefcase again, pulling out a smaller file filled with categorized information. The inheritance breakdown. Kazuki began. Your inheritance is vast and multifaceted, Mr. Midoriya. It spans across multiple areas, both conventional and unconventional. I'll start with the people. Mercenaries and operatives. Your father had contracts with some of the most dangerous individuals on the planet. This includes assassins, black ops specialists, and combat-trained mercenaries. Many of them owe their allegiance to the all-for-one name, and now to you. They can be summoned for missions or protection at your command. Quirk researchers and engineers. A division of scientists and engineers specialized in quirks and their augmentation. These individuals were responsible for creating devices and experiments to enhance quirks. Some were even working on quirk transfer and fusion before your father's capture. International syndicates. Your father maintained alliances with international criminal organizations. From the Yakuza in Japan to the 𝗵𝗃𝗏 in Russia, and even cartels in South America. These groups often relied on him for quirk-based weaponry or strategic planning. They respect power above all else, and they'll align with you if you show them your strength. Politicians and informants. Your father had a network of informants embedded in various government bodies and agencies worldwide. These individuals provide intelligence, cover-ups, and occasionally influence legislation to benefit his operations. They remain active, waiting for new instructions. Resources and holdings. Kazuki continued, flipping to another section of the file. Financial assets. Several offshore accounts containing billions in various currencies. These funds are clean and untraceable, ready for immediate use. Properties and safe houses. Dozens of properties across the globe, including mansions, safe houses, and underground bunkers. Each one is stocked with supplies and weaponry. Arms and technology. Caches of advanced weaponry and technology, both quirk-based and traditional. Your father invested heavily in experimental devices that could amplify or neutralize quirks. These are stored in secure locations. Quirk-destroying drugs and serums. He had a sizable supply of quirk-destroying bullets and experimental serums that can either suppress or enhance quirks. These were originally sourced from the 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 but later produced independently by his researchers. International influence. Your father maintained influence in nations beyond Japan. In several war-torn regions, he operated as both a supplier and a power broker. These connections can be activated if you choose to expand your operations globally. Midoriya's reaction. Midoriya absorbed the information with an unnerving calmness. His mind worked rapidly, piecing together strategies and potential uses for every asset described. Mercenaries, researchers, syndicates, informants. He murmured, leaning back. A global empire waiting to be reclaimed. Kazuki nodded. Precisely. Your father believed in power consolidation, but he also believed in adaptability. These resources are tools. How you use them is up to you. Midoriya's white pupils narrowed. But tell me, is there anyone among his network who doubts my position? Kazuki hesitated before replying. There may be some who require persuasion, but most are loyal to the all-for-one legacy. They'll fall in line once they see your strength. Midoriya smirked faintly. They'll see it soon enough. And the ones who doubt, I'll deal with them personally. Final inquiry before Kazuki could close the briefcase again, Midoriya asked one last question. These scientists and researchers, are they still active? Kazuki nodded. Most of them, yeah. They've been working in secret facilities under strict orders to remain operational until contacted. Midoriya's tone grew colder. Contact them. I'll need their expertise for the next phase of my plan. Kazuki tilted his head curiously. May I ask what that plan entails? Midoriya's gaze turned distant, his voice low but resolute. Revolution. A world where the strong dominate without the facade of heroism or laws. A kingdom forged by my hands, with no one above me. Kazuki smiled, closing his briefcase. Understood. I'll make the arrangements. As Kazuki turned to leave, Midoriya leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. The king of Tartarus was no longer bound by the walls of his prison. He was already shaping the world outside it. Afterwards, the faint, dim light in Midoriya's Tartarus cell cast elongated shadows across the room. Seated at the center of his domain, he exuded an aura of absolute authority. His black sclera and white pupils gleamed ominously as he awaited the arrival of two individuals he had deemed essential to his plans, Lady Nagant and 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏. Moments later, the heavy door creaked open, and two figures stepped inside. Lady Nagant, her presence calm but commanding, leaned against the wall with her arms crossed. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏, ever casual, sauntered in, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Midoriya. You called us king? 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏 asked with his usual straightforward tone. Lady Nagant raised an eyebrow. What's the urgency, Midoriya? You don't summon people unless it's something big. Midoriya smiled faintly, gesturing for them to sit. It is big. That's why I need the two of you here. His voice, deep and resonant like 𝗬𝗏 carried a weight that demanded attention. Nagant and 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏 exchanged glances before taking their places on the metal stools in front of him. Midoriya leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. In 2 to 4 days, I'm escaping Tartarus. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏's eyebrows shot up, and he grinned. About time. Sitting around in this dump doesn't suit you, Midoriya. Lady Nagant, however, was more measured. Escape from Tartarus. That's no small feat. You're talking about breaking out of the most secure prison in existence. Midoriya nodded. Exactly. Which is why I've been preparing for this moment since the day I arrived. Every guard, every patrol route, every possible weak point, I've studied them all. I've also accounted for contingencies. This escape isn't a gamble, it's a certainty. Nagant's sharp gaze softened slightly, impressed by his resolve. And you're telling us because? Midoriya straightened, his white pupils locking onto her. Because I need you both. Nagant, your precision and ability to cover me from a distance will be crucial. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏, your strength and teleportation technique will make sure we outmaneuver anyone foolish enough to stand in our way. 𝗳𝗏𝗄𝗧𝗏 chuckled, leaning back. So, you want me as your ace in the hole? Guess I can't say no to that. But tell me, Midoriya, how sure are you about this plan? Midoriya smirked. Sure enough that failure isn't an option. This isn't just about freedom, it's about taking the first step towards something greater. Nagant narrowed her eyes. If you've thought this through, then I'm with you. But what's the endgame, Midoriya? Once we're out, what's next? Midoriya's expression grew serious. Once we're out, the real work begins. We gather allies, consolidate power, and tear down the farce that is the hero system. No more lies. No more hypocrisy. A world where strength determines everything. Nagant nodded slowly. I see. And you've already decided who you want on your side. Midoriya's smirk returned. I have 10 positions to fill. You two are the first. 𝗃 laughed heartily. First Commander. I like the sound of that. But tell me, what makes us so special? Midoriya's tone softened, but his words carried conviction. Because you both understand what it means to live outside the system. You've seen the rot in society firsthand. And more importantly, you're strong enough to stand by my side. Nagant's lips curled into a faint smile. Flattery won't get you everywhere, but it's a good start. All right, Midoriya, I'm in. 𝗃 grinned, standing up and cracking his knuckles. You've got my fists, King. Let's break out of this cage and show the world what we're made of. Midoriya stood, his presence filling the room. In 2 days, I'll give the signal. When the time comes, follow my lead. Until then, act normal and don't draw suspicion. Nagant pushed herself off the wall. Understood. Just make sure your plan lives up to the hype. 𝗃 clapped a hand on Midoriya's shoulder. Don't worry, King. We've got this. As the two left the cell, Midoriya sat back down, his mind racing with calculations. His eyes, dark as the void, shone with unrelenting determination. The king of Tartarus was about to claim his freedom, and the world would tremble in his wake.